Terry Gene Bollea, best known to the world as Hulk Hogan, was an American professional wrestler and a media personality whose career helped redefine professional wrestling on a global scale. One of the most recognizable figures in sports entertainment history, Hogan became the dominant star of wrestling's modern era, winning championships across multiple promotions and achieving mainstream fame unmatched by any of his contemporaries. Before becoming Hulk Hogan, he competed under several ring names, including Sterling Golden, Terry Boulder, and later Mr. America, before settling into the persona that would define his life. Known for his imposing physique, unmistakable showmanship, blonde Fu Manchu mustache, and bandanas, Hogan began training in the late 1970s with Championship Wrestling from Florida. His career changed permanently after joining the World Wrestling Federation, where he quickly emerged as a company central figure. Hogan's heroic, all-American image became the foundation of wrestling's national explosion. He headlined 8 of the first 9 WrestleMania events and was the face of primetime wrestling through Saturday night's main event. His first reign as WWF champion lasted over 4 years and one of the longest title reigns in company history. He later became the first wrestler to win back-to-back Royal Rumble matches, further cementing his dominance. During this period, wrestling crossed the line from niche entertainment into mainstream culture, with Hogan at its center. In the mid-90s, he made a shocking move to World Championship Wrestling. There he reinvented himself as Hollywood Hulk Hogan, abandoning his heroic image to lead the New World Order. The NWO storyline transformed wrestling's tone and helped ignite the Monday Night Wars, drawing record television audiences and reshaping the industry. Hogan captured the WCW World Heavyweight Championship 6 times and headlined the promotion's biggest events. His ability to adapt and remain relevant across eras became one of his defining traits. After WWF acquired WCW, Hogan returned to the company and won the undisputed WWF Championship, making a long-standing record before stepping away from full-time competition. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2005 and again in 2020 as a member of the NWO, recognizing both sides of his career, the hero and the villain. Outside the ring, he crossed into film, television, and pop culture. He appeared in movies such as Rocky III, No Holds Barred, and Suburban Commando, and also starred in television projects including Thunder in Paradise and Hogan Knows Best. His larger-than-life persona extended into music, as well as fronting the wrestling boot band and releasing Hulk Rules, which charted nationally. Throughout his career, Hogan was known for his loyalty to a small circle of friends and allies. While often criticized for political maneuvering within the business, the closest to him consistently described a man who valued long-standing relationships and protected those he trusted. That loyalty, however, coexisted with a fiercely self-protective approach to his career. Hogan's legacy remains deeply complicated. He publicly acknowledged long-term steroid use and admitted to opposing unionization efforts within wrestling. Later, private recordings became public, revealing racially charged remarks that severely damaged his reputation. Although he won a landmark legal case against Gawker Media, the controversy permanently altered public perception. By the time of his death in July 2025, reactions reflected a divided legacy. To some, he remained the man who carried wrestling into mainstream. To others, his controversies overshadowed his achievements. Hulk Hogan's story endures not a simple tale of hero or villain, but as one of the most influential and contested lives in wrestling history. And this is his story. Hulk Hogan was born Terry Eugene Bollea on August 11, 1953 in Augusta, Georgia. Within a short time, his family relocated to Tampa, Florida, where he would spend nearly all of his formative years. Tampa, in the post-war decades, was a city defined by practicality rather than spectacle. It was blue-collar, conservative, and rooted in traditional ideas about masculinity, work, and hierarchy. The environment mattered. Hogan didn't grow up surrounded by fame or excess. He grew up in a world where status came from physical labor, discipline, and being useful. His father worked as a construction foreman, a job that emphasized endurance, authority, and physical competence. His mother was involved in dance and performance, exposing him to presentation and timing at an early age. These two influences, physical dominance and controlled performance, existed side by side in his household. They were not consciously connected, but together they created the framework that would later define Hogan's public persona. From early childhood, Terry was noticeably larger than other children. He was taller, broader, and stronger, and adults commented on it constantly. Teachers, coaches, and neighbors treated him as someone who would naturally gravitate towards sports or physical work. Compliments focused on his size rather than his intellect. This shaped his self-perception early. He learned that attention followed physical presence, and that standing out physically was the easiest way to be noticed. School reinforced this pattern. He was not academically distinguished, nor was he encouraged to pursue intellectual achievement. Sports became the primary space where he felt validated. Baseball, in particular, gave him structure and identity. As a pitcher, he found a role that rewarded strength, repetition, and control. Coaches invested in him. Teammates relied on him. For the first time, he could imagine a future that made sense. That future ended abruptly when a back injury destroyed his baseball prospects. The injury was not just physical, it was psychological. Terry lost the only identity he had fully committed to. The sudden removal of baseball forced him into an identity vacuum at a critical age. He was still large, physically imposing, but now aimless. The injury planted a fear that would follow him for the rest of his life, that success could be temporary, fragile, and easily taken away. Without baseball, he drifted. He turned to music, playing bass guitar in local bands, and to bodybuilding, where progress was measurable and controlled. Weightlifting rewarded discipline. Each increase in size felt like insurance against irrelevance. Each compliment reinforced a lesson he had already internalized. Physical presence equaled worth. Wrestling entered his life through opportunity rather than passion. Promoters and wrestlers noticed him because of his size and suggested he try professional wrestling. Terry didn't resist the idea. Wrestling aligned perfectly with everything he believed about survival and visibility. It rewarded physical presence, it turned size into currency, and offered a stage large enough to contain him. Most importantly, he saw it as a platform. Early training exposed his limitations. He struggled with fundamentals, timing, and technique. But wrestling didn't demand technical excellence from him. It demanded believability. He understood instinctively that audiences needed to feel him more than they understand him. By the time he committed to wrestling, Terry's physiological framework was firmly established. He believed that relevance came from being seen. He believed that strength justified authority. He believed that attention was safety. Wrestling didn't create these beliefs, it gave them a home. As he got older, the distinction between Terry Bollea and what he would become began to blur. The seeds of Hulk Hogan were not planted in wrestling. They were planted in childhood, injury, and the fear of being forgotten. Terry entered professional wrestling in his early 20s, not as a lifelong fan chasing a dream, but as a physically imposing young man looking for a stable identity and future. It attracted him because it valued size, presence, and durability. These were the traits he already possessed. When he began training in Florida, the gap between his physical gifts and his technical ability was immediately obvious. He was awkward in the ring, slow to pick up footwork, and inconsistent with timing. What he lacked in polish, however, he made up for in willingness to listen and an instinctive understanding of attention. Early trainers and promoters quickly recognized that Terry was not going to be a technical wrestler. His value lay elsewhere. He looked like something audiences could believe in. Wrestling, particularly in that era, rewarded visual credibility above all else. Terry learned that lesson quickly. Rather than fighting his limitations, he leaned into them. He focused on presence, body language, and simple, forceful movements. He learned how to stand, how to pause, and how to let a crowd absorb him before he ever locked up. When he was given the ring name Hulk Hogan, the shift was immediate and consequential. The name itself imposed expectation. Hulk suggested size, power. Hogan grounded him in something that sounded traditional and American. The name transformed him from a man into a concept. Hogan did not create this transformation alone, but he understood its importance immediately. He began to shape his behavior around the name. He exaggerated his movements, projected confidence, even when unsure, and leaned into spectacle. His early exposure to the WWF taught him a critical lesson about the business. Perception mattered more than reality. He wasn't the most skilled wrestler in the locker room, but he was the most visible. Vince McMahon recognized this and positioned Hogan accordingly. He was presented not as a developing talent, but as a finished product. This accelerated push created resentment among peers, but it also clarified Hogan's place. He was being groomed not as a wrestler, but as the face of the company, transitioning from a regional promotion to national entertainment brand. He adapted quickly to the political realities of wrestling. He learned that reliability, obedience, and availability mattered as much as performance. He showed up early, stayed late, and avoided scandals. He aligned himself with management and understood that loyalty to the office translated into protection. This behavior was not accidental, it was survival. Hogan recognized that his rise depended on trust from the people who controlled the machine. His promo style evolved deliberately. He didn't speak like other wrestlers. He simplified language, repeated phrases, and spoke directly to the audience rather than his opponent. He framed matches as moral struggles rather than athletic contests. This was not an intellectual decision. It was instinctive. He understood that fans needed to feel invested emotionally, not impressed technically. His promos became predictable, but predictability created comfort. Audiences knew who he was and what he represented. When he defeated the Iron Sheik to win the WWF Championship, the moment represented more than a title change. It marked a shift. The company was committing fully to spectacle, accessibility, and mass appeal. Hogan was the embodiment of that shift. He didn't simply accept the role, he embraced it completely. He understood that being champion meant responsibility beyond matches. It meant media appearances, public behavior, and consistency. Hogan internalized the idea that he was now carrying the company. Behind the scenes, this responsibility translated into control. He became protective of his position almost immediately. He influenced finishes, limited challengers, and shaped narratives to ensure his continued dominance. This behavior will later draw criticism, but at the time, it reinforced stability. Hogan believed that if he faltered, the company would collapse. Whether that belief was accurate or not, it governed his decisions. Emotionally, Hogan experienced validation unlike anything he had known. The insecurity born from his baseball injury was temporarily quieted. He was no longer searching for relevance. He had it. Crowds reacted to him instinctively. Children idolized him. Adults accepted him. The applause confirmed everything he believed about size, presence, and visibility. At the same time, a new anxiety emerged. Hogan became aware that his value was tied entirely to reaction. If the crowd turned, he would lose everything. This fear drove him to double down on the image. He avoided risks, protected his body selectively, and clung to formula. Change represented danger. Familiarity represented safety. By the time he settled into his role as WWF champion, the line between Terry Bollea and Hulk Hogan had begun to erode. He was no longer performing a character. He was living one. The validation was intoxicating, but it came with a price. He began to measure his worth not by satisfaction, but by response. By the early 1990s, Hulk Hogan's position at the center of the World Wrestling Federation was no longer secure. Though still the most recognizable star in the industry, wrestling culture was changing. Audiences were aging, younger viewers wanted more edge, and the cartoon morality of the 1980s was losing grip. Hogan could feel the shift before ratings reflected it. Crowd reaction softened, particularly in larger markets, and the certainty that once defined his presence began to fade. At the same time, his body was breaking down. Years of leg drops and constant touring had left him with chronic back and hip pain. By 1992 and 93, mobility was limited and recovery slower. Matches became more predictable out of necessity. His appearance at King of the Ring 1993 and the abrupt title win over Yokozuna at WrestleMania 9 exposed a growing disconnect between Hogan's mythic image and his physical reality. Behind the scenes, WWF was shifting direction as well. The steroid trial and public scrutiny forced Vince McMahon to pivot towards smaller, more technical performers such as Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. Hogan was still valuable, but no longer untouchable. The realization cut deeply. Wrestling had taught Hogan that decline was rarely gradual. One day a star mattered, the next he didn't. The fear of becoming expendable followed him closely. When WCW, backed by Turner Broadcasting, offered a guaranteed contract in 1994, the appeal went far beyond money. It promised security and insulation from creative uncertainty. His debut at Bash at the Beach on July 17, 1994, defeating Ric Flair for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship, symbolized a seismic shift. The industry's biggest star had changed sides. WCW initially presented Hogan exactly how the WWF had: heroic, dominant, and central. He headlined pay-per-views and feuded with established names like Ric Flair, Vader, wrestling matches at Clash of the Champions, Halloween Havoc, Super Brawl, and Uncensored. But fans' response was increasingly muted. The act felt familiar. Nostalgia was no longer enough. Hogan recognized that repetition was becoming a liability. Tensions behind the scenes reflected his stagnation. His feud with Vader exposed early political fracture, as disagreements over match finishes led Vader being quietly pushed aside. Hogan's influence within the WCW was growing, but so was resentment. Even so, he understood that clinging to old formula would eventually render him irrelevant. At the same time, WCW began shifting tone. On May 27, 1996, Scott Hall appeared on Monday Nitro, delivering a promo that blurred reality and storyline. Kevin Nash followed soon after. Both men had long-standing relationships with Hogan from their WWF days. More importantly, they shared his understanding of leverage, contracts, and control. They viewed wrestling less as mythology and more as power dynamics. From that shared outlook emerged the New World Order. The concept projected traditional hero versus villain storytelling and embraced chaos, insider language, and audience cynicism. Hogan recognized that turning against his heroic image could restore relevance. The decision was risky, but stagnation felt worse. The turning point came at Bash at the Beach on July 7, 1996. As the mystery third man, Hogan entered the audience by dropping the leg on Randy Savage. The reaction was explosive. Boos, thrown debris, genuine outrage. The betrayal worked precisely because it violated everything he had represented for more than a decade. Overnight, he transformed into Hollywood Hogan. The new persona rejected its sincerity in favor of arrogance and entitlement. Dressed in black and white, Hogan mocked fans, insulted WCW, and framed himself as untouchable. The NWO quickly became the most influential angle in wrestling. Events such as Hog Wild, Fall Brawl, Starrcade, and the highly anticipated Starrcade 1997 match with Sting defined the era. WCW overtook WWF in the ratings for 83 consecutive weeks. Behind the scenes, Hogan's power increased significantly. His contract gave him creative control, and his inner circle, particularly Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and WCW executive Eric Bischoff, became central in decision-making. Loyalty mattered, access mattered, creative control consolidated around a small group. While Hogan maintained professional respect for figures like Randy Savage, Sting, Ric Flair, and Bret Hart, relationships were often strained by politics and competing visions. Younger wrestlers such as Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Dean Malenko increasingly felt marginalized as the NWO dominated airtime. Physically, Hogan's condition continued to decline. Surgeries loomed, pain was constant, and his in-ring work had become more limited. The NWO format compensated for this, allowing him to rely on promos, presence, and storyline positioning rather than athletic performance. It preserved his aura while reducing physical risk. Emotionally, the heel turn allowed Hogan to express resentment he had long carried towards fans who had turned on him, critics who dismissed his abilities, and an industry that constantly threatened replacement. But the same armor that protected him also isolated him. Trust narrowed, relationships became transactional, the locker room grew divided. As the late 1990s progressed, WCW began to unravel. Management turnover, bloated storytelling, and internal politics weakened cohesion. The chaos that once fueled the NWO now undermined the company. Hogan recognized the pattern. He'd seen it before, success giving way to instability. By the end of his WCW run, Hogan had achieved one of the most dramatic reinventions in wrestling history. He proved he could adapt, redefine himself, and dominate under radically different conditions. Yet the transformation came at a cost. It reinforced his reliance on power and control as safeguards against irrelevance. The fear that had driven him from the beginning never fully disappeared. Reinvention postponed decline, but it didn't erase it. The NWO saved Hogan's career, and in doing so, revealed the contradictions at its core. In the aftermath of the wreckage left by WCW, Hulk Hogan didn't simply walk away from a failed company. He emerged from it exposed. WCW didn't collapse because of one man, but Hogan stood at the center of nearly every decision that accelerated its rot. By the end, the company had become a closed ecosystem designed to protect aging stars at the expense of momentum, logic, and future value. Hogan wasn't a passenger in that process. He was one of its architects. From the moment he arrived in WCW, his contract ensured creative control unlike anything seen before. That power was not used to elevate the company, it was used to insulate himself. Finishes were rewritten, storylines redirected, and entire arcs abandoned if they threatened his position. Younger talent wasn't evaluated on crowd response or performances, they were evaluated on whether they endangered Hogan's relevance. Bret Hart is the most damning example. Hart arrived in WCW as one of the most respected wrestlers in the world, fresh off the most infamous controversy in the industry's history, carrying credibility, legitimacy, and fan sympathy. Instead of being positioned as a pillar for the company's future, he was neutralized. Hogan resisted meaningful programs with Hart, knowing that Hart's in-ring credibility exposed everything Hogan lacked. The result was a squandered prime incoherent booking and a star pushed to the bottom at the exact moment he should have been central. The pattern repeated with Sting. After more than a year of the most organic build-up WCW ever produced, Hogan ensured that Sting's crowning moment at Starrcade 1997 was compromised. The finish was muddied. The authority undercut the victory. The clarity was stripped away. Hogan didn't just lose, he controlled how he lost, and in doing so, poisoned the payoff. Sting recovered in popularity, but the moment was gone forever. WCW never truly regained that trust. Then there was Goldberg. Goldberg was everything Hogan feared, new, dominant, and immune to politics. When Goldberg's rise became unavoidable, Hogan positioned himself as a gatekeeper rather than the conduit. Their program revolved around Hogan's terms, not Goldberg's momentum. Even in defeat, Hogan ensured the spotlight remained split, diluted, and temporary. Goldberg survived it, but WCW's ability to build another phenomenon like him didn't. Hogan's damage wasn't limited to main event obstruction. Booker T, who was repeatedly denied credibility through demeaning being framed as unworthy of Hogan's respect, even while holding championships and carrying crowd support. The message was clear. Talent could succeed only up to the ceiling Hogan allowed. Crossing that line invited humiliation, not opportunity. Scott Steiner represents another kind of sabotage. Steiner reinvented himself into one of the most compelling, volatile characters WCW had in its final years. Instead of being harnessed as a disruptive force that could refresh a product, he was kept orbiting. Hogan's narratives never allowed to eclipse him. WCW's late-era desperation should have demanded risk. Hogan demanded control. Even those who appeared to benefit from proximity paid a cost. Randy Savage, long-framed Hogan's brother-in-arms, was quietly constrained for years. Savage's creativity, intensity, and willingness to evolve threatened Hogan's static heroism. Rather than collaborate as equals, Hogan enforced his hierarchy. Savage remained popular, but always second, always capped, always reminded where the ceiling was. This wasn't competitiveness. It was preservation through suppression. By the time WCW collapsed, Hogan's influence had helped leave behind a company bloated with guaranteed contracts, stripped of emerging stars, and creatively paralyzed. When WCW died, it wasn't because wrestling had moved on, it was because WCW could not move past Hogan. The irony is that when Hogan returned to the WWE, the same habits followed him, but without the leverage. His backstage reputation preceded him. The industry he had once dominated had evolved into one that no longer needed him. When scandal finally stripped away the remaining protection, there was no groundswell of support from peers whose careers he had delayed, redirected, or diminished. What emerged in the retrospective wasn't a misunderstood icon. It was a pattern. Control prioritized over creativity, ego over ecosystem, self-preservation over succession. Hogan just didn't bury talent. He delayed the industry's ability to replace him, then blamed the business when it struggled to do so. The wreckage of WCW was not accidental. It was a combined result of a system built around one man's fear of irrelevance. And when that system collapsed, it revealed the truth Hogan spent decades avoiding. Greatness that cannot tolerate successors is not legacy. It's sabotage with better lighting. What ended Hulk Hogan wasn't a word. It was a rant. Long, angry, and spoken with comfort, not regret. It wasn't a mistake caught on tape. It was his worldview revealed. There was no shock in his voice, no pause, no awareness that he was crossing a line. Only entitlement and hierarchy spoken freely. That context erased every defense. The myth didn't collapse because of outrage. It collapsed because the mask came off. When no one was supposed to be listening, Hogan said exactly who he was, and wrestling finally believed him.
A longtime wrestling personality who grew up in Cambridge passed away today. Kevin Sullivan, nicknamed the Taskmaster and the Boston Battler, died. A cause of death has not been revealed, but a GoFundMe set up back in May said that he was involved in a devastating accident. The WWE released a statement calling him a unique and influential figure in sports entertainment history. Sullivan began his career training in Boston during the late 60s. He was 74 years old.
Kevin Francis Sullivan was born on October 26, 1949, and grew up in the South Boston area, a tough working-class neighborhood that shaped his personality and later his ring persona. His family was Irish Catholic, part of a tight-knit Boston community that valued hard work, loyalty, and toughness. Those cultural traits, pride in one's heritage, respect for physical grit, and a rebellious streak against authority would deeply influence Sullivan's worldview and ultimately his wrestling character. South Boston in the 1950s and early 1960s was a hard-edged environment. Brawls, neighborhood pride, and loyalty to the Southie identity were part of daily life. Kids like Sullivan grew up surrounded by strong personalities, church life, and street culture. Many of his childhood friends pursued boxing or football, and Sullivan was no different. Sports became both his outlet and his escape from the neighborhood limits. From a young age, Sullivan was known for his remarkable athletic ability and compact muscular build. Standing only around 5'9", he wasn't the tallest athlete, but he was exceptionally strong for his size and had a relentless work ethic. He excelled in football, wrestling, and track, earning local recognition during his teenage years. He attended Boston College High School, an institution that emphasized both academics and athletics. There, Sullivan distinguished himself as a standout in amateur wrestling and football, developing a taste for competition that was both physical and psychological. Teachers and coaches described him as a natural leader, intense, disciplined, and fiercely competitive. His early exposure to amateur wrestling in high school planted the first seeds of what would become his professional path. Unlike many later pro wrestlers who transitioned from football or powerlifting, Sullivan's foundation was technical. He learned real grappling before stepping into a ring. After high school, Sullivan attended Boston University, where he continued to compete in athletics. Though accounts differ on how long he stayed enrolled, most sources confirm that he was active in both wrestling and bodybuilding circles in the late 1960s. He trained obsessively, often balancing school with time in the gym. It was during this period that he developed a lifelong fascination with strength training and physique culture. The late 1960s saw the rise of bodybuilding icons like Steve Reeves and Reg Park, who influenced a generation of young athletes. Sullivan began entering local bodybuilding competitions and won several regional amateur contests across Massachusetts and New England. His physique, thick, compact, and carved from heavy compound lifting, would later distinguish him from many of his contemporaries in the wrestling world. By 1970, Sullivan had become a respected competitor in the New England bodybuilding scene. He trained alongside local legends at hardcore gyms around Boston, including the early Gold's Gym-style establishments where lifters and wrestlers mingled. This connection to the gym subculture would prove crucial when he later entered professional wrestling. Several trainers and promoters frequented those same gyms in search of talent. Boston had a thriving wrestling scene in the 1960s and early 1970s. Promoters like Tony Santos Sr. ran small promotions, often using high school gyms and armories as venues. Sullivan began attending those shows as a teenager, watching regional heroes like Killer Kowalski, Arnold Skaaland, and Bruno Sammartino when they came to town. Killer Kowalski, in particular, became a major influence. Known for his intelligence, discipline, and scientific approach to wrestling, Kowalski represented the bridge between legitimate athleticism and the theatrical world of professional wrestling. Sullivan admired Kowalski's ability to make violence seem both cerebral and believable. Later, when Sullivan would create his own dark, psychologically complex character, Kowalski's example of controlled chaos would echo through his work. By the late 1960s, Sullivan began quietly pursuing the possibility of entering the wrestling business. Through his bodybuilding connections, he met several local wrestlers who worked small circuits around New England. Some reports suggest he began helping set up rings and doing small behind-the-scenes jobs around 1970 to 1971 to learn the business from the ground up. Sullivan's break into wrestling was gradual. Around 1970, he started informal training sessions at local gyms and small halls under the guidance of wrestlers connected to Tony Santos' promotion. His early trainers were journeymen and local veterans who specialized in teaching fundamentals, mat work, bumps, and ring psychology. He was also influenced by the tough man style that dominated New England at the time. Unlike the larger-than-life characters of later eras, Boston area wrestling emphasized toughness and believability. Sullivan learned to project intensity and credibility, even though he wasn't a giant. He continued competing in local bodybuilding shows through 1971, while preparing for his first professional matches. That year marked a turning point. He had the size, athletic background, and regional connections to step in the ring professionally. The following year, 1972, would see his official debut in the wrestling business. But by the end of 1971, Kevin Sullivan was still an ambitious, driven 25-year-old athlete on the brink of transformation. Everything that would later define Sullivan, his psychological depth, his understanding of athletic performance, and his fascination with power and control, had roots in this early period. Before he became the Taskmaster, before the satanic imagery and dark promos, Kevin Sullivan was a disciplined, ambitious kid from South Boston who saw pro wrestling both as an art and as a survival strategy. By early 1972, Kevin Sullivan's bodybuilding success and regional gym reputation had caught the attention of local wrestling promoters in New England. His name had been floating around small-time wrestling circles. He had the look, the strength, and most importantly, the attitude promoters liked. He began working under the guidance of Tony Santos Sr., whose international championship wrestling promotion ran small shows throughout Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Santos' operation was modest. Cards were often held in VFW halls and local armories, but it was a legitimate entry point for a young talent. Sullivan debuted in early 1972, often billed as simply Kevin Sullivan from Boston. He played a clean-cut, athletic babyface, the kind of blue-collar good guy regional fans could relate to. His early matches were mostly short openers, learning experience against veterans like Larry Winters, Johnny Ringo, and occasionally students of Killer Kowalski. Though still green, Sullivan showed remarkable ring intelligence. His movements were crisp, and he understood how to tell a story physically, a skill that came from his years of watching old-school pros. While not flashy, his matches were intense and believable. His stamina set him apart from other rookies. By 1973, he had begun traveling the northeastern wrestling circuit, picking up bookings with regional promoters who knew Santos or Kowalski. He wrestled in Vermont, Maine, and upstate New York, often working 2 or 3 shows a week for modest pay. These were the days of paying his dues: small locker rooms, long drives, and handshake deals. He also started to gain experience in other small territories, including brief stints in Georgia and Florida, where promoters were experimenting with young, athletic talents rather than relying solely on giants. Florida, in particular, left a mark on Sullivan, with its wild fans, colorful heels, and emphasis on charisma, showed him that wrestling could be both performance art and psychological warfare. During this time, Sullivan also began to study the mental side of wrestling. He observed how heels manipulated audiences, not just through physical dominance, but through pacing, gestures, and tone. He began keeping notes on what worked, subtle cues that made crowds hate you, timing tricks that made baby faces look sympathetic, and body language that drew emotional reactions. Sullivan's first major career turning point came in 1974, when he earned a booking with Championship Wrestling from Florida, one of the premier territories in the National Wrestling Alliance. CWF was run by Eddie Graham, a promoter known for his deep understanding of wrestling psychology and storytelling. In Florida, Sullivan wrestled under his real name, primarily as a babyface mid-carder. He wasn't pushed as a major star yet, but he impressed the veterans with his professionalism and conditioning. He worked with the likes of Bob Roop, Mike Graham, Steve Kern, and Dick Slater, absorbing knowledge from each. Eddie Graham's influence on Sullivan was profound. Graham taught his wrestlers that the audience's suspension of belief came from details: how you reacted, how you sold pain, how you looked at the crowd. Under Graham, Sullivan learned that wrestling wasn't about moves, it was about emotion. By 1975, Sullivan has started to feel confined by his role as a bland babyface. He recognized that the market was saturated with good-looking young athletes, and he needed something different to stand out. Drawing inspiration from his Boston upbringing, where toughness, intimidation, and psychological control were part of everyday life, Sullivan began experimenting with a more aggressive, mean-spirited character. His transformation began subtly: shorter promos, more intensity in the ring, and a simmering hostility in interviews. He stopped smiling for the fans and started glaring at them. By late 1975, the clean-cut Boston athlete had evolved into a rugged, unpredictable presence. In interviews from that time, Sullivan described the change as finding the real part of me that fit the business. He didn't yet have the full taskmaster persona, but he was developing the psychological base for it. The idea that control, intimidation, and manipulation could be more powerful than brute force. Sullivan also took heavy influence from the psychological heels of that time: Terry Funk, Ernie Ladd, and the Sheik. He saw that evil could be more fascinating than good, and that fear could sell tickets.
By 1976, he began taking bookings on the Northeast again, working for promotions connected to Vince McMahon Sr. in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. While he wasn't a featured player, his reputation as a strong hand was growing. He wrestled occasionally in Madison Square Garden, facing names like Angelo Savoldi and Johnny Rodz. Though his runs were short, they gave him exposure to larger crowds and the discipline of big market production. Back in Boston, he also started dabbling in promotional side work, helping with small events and connecting young wrestlers to promoters. Sullivan had a knack for backstage logistics and talent relations, something that would define his later years as a booker and creative mind. By 1977, he had firmly established himself as a reliable, believable worker, and one of the most cerebral performers of his generation. While others relied on brute force or gimmicks, Sullivan was studying psychology, mythology, and human behavior. The intellectual curiosity began to manifest in his wrestling character. He was experimenting with body language, symbolism, and voice tone. Observers noted, even in small venues, he commanded attention just by how he carried himself. Crouched, calculating, with eyes that suggested hidden intent. Though his later fame as a Prince of Darkness was years away, the seeds of that transformation were already planted by 1977. Sullivan was becoming fascinated with how fear worked, not just in wrestling, but in storytelling. By the end of 1977, Sullivan was no longer just a capable wrestler. He was a student of the art form. What came next, his dive into darkness, into the late 70s and 80s, would make him one of the wrestling's most complex and controversial figures. By 1978, he was at a creative crossroads. He was respected for his work ethic and ring psychology, but had yet to find a signature identity that would elevate him beyond the mid-card. The wrestling world was changing. The old regional babyfaces were losing ground to larger-than-life characters, and audiences wanted spectacle mixed with realism. Sullivan's fascination with human behavior, control, and the darker corners of mythology began influencing his promos. He had been reading about psychology, religious symbolism, and the occult, not out of true belief, but as a way to understand how people reacted to fear. He realized while fans might respect a hero, they would never forget a villain who frightened them. During this period, he worked in various territories including Georgia Championship Wrestling, Southeastern Championship Wrestling, and Florida. In each stop, he refined his in-ring persona, from a mean-spirited brawler to something more methodical, unpredictable, and sinister. The transformation was subtle but chilling. By 1980, he returned to Championship Wrestling from Florida, the same promotion where he had once been a clean-cut rookie. This time he brought a new attitude. Eddie Graham, the master of psychology, saw potential in Sullivan's evolving darkness and gave him freedom to explore it. Sullivan began portraying a bitter, corrupt soul, delusioned with the hypocrisy of heroes in wrestling. He positioned himself as an anti-hero, someone who had rejected traditional morality. His promos hinted he wasn't just another wrestler. He was a manipulator, a tempter, and a believer in chaos. People fear what they can't understand, he'd say in hushed tones, eyes unblinking at the camera. The audience didn't know whether to boo or to stay silent. That unease made him one of the most effective villains in the territory. The Kevin Sullivan character had fully taken shape as a Prince of Darkness. It was one of the most original and polarizing personas in wrestling at the time. He surrounded himself with followers, creating what became known as the Army of Darkness. The stable that included bizarre and intimidating figures such as Purple Haze, Mark Lewin, the Fallen Angel, Luna Vachon, The Lock, and Bob Roop. Their presentation was ritualistic, cryptic promos, eerie lighting, and disturbing imagery involving candles, robes, and inverted crosses. To wrestling fans, it was pure theater, but it worked. Fans in Florida genuinely feared Sullivan. The local press even reported on rumors that Sullivan was dabbling in black magic, and church groups protested shows. Sullivan leaned into it, using the controversy to build heat. He understood that belief, even mistaken belief, could sell tickets. One of Sullivan's most famous early programs was against Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream. The contrast between Rhodes, charismatic, all-America, beloved, and Sullivan, dark, manipulative, and cryptic, was perfect. Sullivan's promos during this feud became legendary for their psychological precision. He spoke softly, deliberately, sometimes quoting scriptures, sometimes whispering names or phrases that meant nothing but sounded sinister. He rarely shouted, which made fans lean closer. It forced attention. He once said on camera, "Dusty Rhodes preaches dreams, but I preach truth. And the truth is that good men lie and evil men tell the truth." That kind of promo was unheard in wrestling at the time. It wasn't a cartoonish heel speech. It was theater. Eddie Graham and Dusty both understood how to frame it perfectly. With Rhodes as a moral light and Sullivan as a corrupt shadow, the rivalry became one of the most talked about programs in Florida wrestling history. By the end of 1982 and early 83, Sullivan had mastered the art of blurring fiction and reality. Fans legitimately believed he had practiced witchcraft or devil worship. He fueled that belief by giving cryptic interviews and avoiding breaking character in public. He used symbolism in his segments, chalk circles, candles, ritual-like actions, but he always insisted these were metaphors for control and power, not religion. Still, Florida fans took it literally. This was long before kayfabe was common knowledge, and Sullivan used that like a scalpel. It was performance art disguised as a wrestling television show. Off camera, Sullivan was anything but the character he portrayed. He was disciplined, polite, and deeply intellectual. He trained hard and stayed in remarkable shape for his size. He also became increasingly involved in booking and creative work, helping with match finishes and character development for younger talent. Eddie Graham recognized Sullivan's creative instincts and gave him booking responsibilities by 1984, allowing him to help shape storylines for the Florida territory. This was rare. Few wrestlers were trusted with that level of influence while still actively performing. By the mid-1980s, he was one of the most controversial and influential figures in territorial wrestling. His character drew comparisons to horror films and counterculture movements. The satanic panic that swept through North America during that decade made his act even more provocative. Church groups protested outside arenas. Parents complained to local stations. Newspapers ran articles questioning whether wrestling was promoting the occult. For Sullivan and the Florida office, that meant business was booming. His creative approach influenced the future generations of dark wrestlers, from Jake the Snake Roberts and The Undertaker to the brood of 1990 anti-heroes who used darkness and psychological realism as character foundations. Between 1978 to 1985, Kevin Sullivan redefined the wrestling villain character type. He turned darkness into an intellectual art form, a character built not on brute strength, but on psychology, philosophy, and fear. By 1985, Sullivan was no longer just a character. He was a force of creative disruption. His work in Florida became a blueprint for modern wrestling storytelling, and his mind for manipulation and fear would soon take him beyond the South into the national spotlight.
By 1986, Kevin Sullivan's reputation as both inventive performer and creative mind had spread beyond the Florida territory. The National Wrestling Alliance was consolidating under Jim Crockett Promotions, which aired nationally through Superstation WTBS. The territory system was fading, but Sullivan's work in Florida, with its eerie presentation and masterful storytelling, had made him a sought-after name among promoters who valued psychology over size. When the Florida Territory's fortunes declined following Eddie Graham's death in 1985, Sullivan knew he needed to evolve. He had been both a top heel and a part-time booker in CWF, but national wrestling was changing. The rise of Vince McMahon's WWF had made larger-than-life characters mainstream. Sullivan's occult act, while brilliant, risked being seen as outdated by casual fans. His next challenge was to adapt his mind game-driven psychology to a broader, television-orientated audience. In 1987, he joined Jim Crockett Promotions, bringing his creative instincts with him. Rather than recycle his satanic cult character, he invented something more grounded, yet equally manipulative. Known as a varsity club, the idea was simple but brilliant. Sullivan, the veteran coach, surrounded himself with legitimate amateur wrestlers. Mike Rotundo, Rick Steiner, and later Steve Williams and Dan Spivey, forming a heel faction that claimed to represent the superiority of collegiate athletes over the uneducated brawlers. Where the Army of Darkness had been about fear and mysticism, the Varsity Club was about control and intellect. Sullivan played the role of a psychological manipulator, pitting his protégés against each other while maintaining dominance as a scheming mentor. He would frequently interfere in matches, barking orders like a deranged gym instructor, and subtly sowing jealousy among his recruits. Fans who remembered Sullivan's earlier work saw this as an evolution. The occult leader has become something even more terrifying, a mind manipulator grounded in reality. The Varsity Club became one of the most talked about heel groups of the late 1980s in the NWA. Sullivan's feuds during this period were both layered and physical. His matches weren't flashy, but his promos were mesmerizing. He blended calm intellectual delivery with flashes of manic energy. He would speak in riddles, warn opponents of inevitable destruction, or invoke lessons learned from the shadows. This was his Florida psychology, adapted for national TV. By 1988, Sullivan had established himself not just as a character, but as a creative architect. Behind the scenes, he began collaborating with the WCW booking team, contributing finishes, character arcs, and storyline pacing ideas. His background under Eddie Graham gave him an instinct for long-term booking, something WCW would increasingly rely on in the years ahead. In-ring, Sullivan began to tone down the overt darkness and instead lean into realism. His physique remained impressive, the product of decades of disciplined bodybuilding, which made his shorter stature work to his advantage. His offense emphasized impact over spectacle, short punches, knees to the body, and violent ring psychology. During the Great American Bash tours of 1988 and 1989, Sullivan was a consistent mid to upper card presence. He wasn't the top draw, but he was the reliable heel who made the others look like stars, a craftsman of ring pacing and heat generation. By 1989, Jim Crockett Promotions had officially become World Championship Wrestling under Turner Broadcasting. Sullivan remained an integral player both on screen and backstage. He continued managing and wrestling for the Varsity Club, but as the faction began to dissolve, he pivoted toward new creative directions. In 1990, he began working as a key figure in WCW's mid-card feuds and creative experiments. He contributed to developing characters and was known behind the scenes for being one of the few minds who could translate territory-style storytelling to national television. Sullivan's greatest skill wasn't just performance. It was his understanding that wrestling psychology was about audience emotion, not moves. He believed that fear, anticipation, and betrayal were universal, and he applied those truths to everything he booked. By the end of the 80s, he was respected as one of the smartest, most creative minds in professional wrestling. Though he never achieved main event superstardom as an in-ring performer, his influence as a storyteller, booker, and mentor was undeniable. Wrestlers like Mick Foley and Brian Pillman later cited Sullivan as one of the few veterans who taught them how to think about wrestling rather than just perform it. He helped shape the tone of WCW's storytelling philosophy heading into the 1990s, more layered, psychological, and character-driven. The Varsity Club officially disbanded in 1990, marking the close of one of Sullivan's most successful creative runs. Each member went on to achieve additional success. Mike Rotunda as IRS and WWF, Rick Steiner as part of the Steiner Brothers, and Steve Williams, Dr. Death International star. For Sullivan, this was both an ending and a beginning. He had proven he could reinvent himself twice, and now WCW executives saw him not just as a performer, but as a booker in waiting. His mind for structure, pacing, and reality-based drama would soon propel him to one of the most powerful creative roles in wrestling. By the dawn of the 90s, Kevin Sullivan was more than a character. He was a philosopher of wrestling. His next decade would see him evolve into one of the most controversial and influential bookers in WCW history, navigating chaos both in the ring and behind the curtain. By the early 1990s, Kevin Sullivan had become one of WCW's most reliable creative minds. His in-ring work was respected, but his backstage psychology is what made him invaluable. Wrestlers and executives viewed him as a story mechanic, someone who understood not only what should happen in a match, but why fans cared. WCW leadership shifted constantly during this period. Hurd, Frey, Watts all clashed in philosophy. Through the turbulence, Sullivan quietly studied the product. He helped craft finishes, shape promos, and teach wrestlers the importance of pacing and emotional intent. To many, he became the locker room's unofficial counselor. To management, he was the one voice whose instincts stayed consistent despite corporate turnover. The influence prepared him for the next chapter, one that would reshape WCW's direction and his personal life. Sullivan's creative world changed when he brought his wife, Nancy, into WCW. She had roots in Florida, but WCW let her expand the character into a seductive manipulator, the perfect extension of Sullivan's psychological storytelling. Nancy's presence boosted Sullivan's influence. Wrestlers valued her feedback, and she added weight to Sullivan's ideas about layered motivations and moral dilemmas. But the same realism Sullivan prized on screen began straining their marriage. His insistence on blurring storylines with real life would create cracks that soon became impossible to separate. When Eric Bischoff began signing Hogan and other WWF stars, Sullivan revived an occult-themed persona, the Taskmaster. The goal wasn't pure camp, it was transitional. Hogan needed a cartoonishly evil foil while WCW rebuilt realism underneath. The Dungeon of Doom served that purpose. It was theatrical enough for Hogan's world, yet intentionally temporary. Beneath it, Sullivan helped elevate a wrestler who represented WCW's future, Chris Benoit. Sullivan saw Benoit as the antidote to cartoon-era wrestling, intense, believable, and grounded. He paired Benoit with women to add emotional weight, writing an angle that implied Benoit was stealing Nancy from him. The story worked too well. On-screen tension bled into real life, and Benoit and Nancy formed a genuine relationship. Sullivan, as booker, pushed the angle harder, booking stiff matches with Benoit to heighten realism, even as his marriage dissolved behind the scenes. The locker room was split between admiration and pity. It became wrestling's most infamous example of kayfabe turning into reality. Nitro surged, the NWA exploded, and Bischoff gained near total control. Sullivan structured psychologically driven booking clashed with the NWO's loose, ego-heavy creative style. Hogan, Nash, and Hall wanted spontaneity and dominance. Sullivan pushed for logic and consequence. Meetings became battles. Sullivan remained respected, but the NWO became unstoppable. His marriage was gone, and WCW no longer followed his creative compass. By 1998, Sullivan's influence was fading. Younger talents like Benoit, Guerrero, Malenko, and Saturn were frustrated with WCW politics. Sullivan still supported them creatively, but his personal history with Benoit made collaboration strained. When Turner executives reinstated Sullivan as head booker in 2000, Benoit and others refused to work under him and walked out, joining WWF as the Radicals. The revolt symbolized WCW's dysfunction and ended Sullivan's authority. By mid-2000s, he was removed. By 2001, WCW was gone. After WCW, Sullivan retreated to Florida and transitioned into a behind-the-scenes mentor. He taught psychology to young wrestlers and helped independent promotions craft storylines built on emotional realism rather than spectacle. His core lessons remained simple. You can't make wrestling real. You can only make people forget it's fake. In later years, Sullivan became a thoughtful voice on podcasts and interviews. He discussed Nancy and Benoit with restraint, critiqued modern booking with precision, and praised promotions willing to take creative risks. His philosophies, ambiguous characters, long-form arcs, psychological grounding, echo through modern wrestling, even without him holding a formal role. From Boston gyms to WCW's booking room, from a cult villain to philosophical mentor, Kevin Sullivan remains one of wrestling's most complex and influential figures. His stories weren't just written, they were lived. His enduring lesson, the move doesn't matter, the meaning does. The creed that shaped every area he touched and defines the man behind the myth, known as the Taskmaster.
Hey, this is WWE Hall of Famer from the Legion of Doom, Road War Animal, and you're watching another original wrestling documentary. Oh, what a rush.
He wasn't born into fame, he was born into a pecking order. John Hodger Laurinaitis, middle of three boys, whose last name would eventually echo in stadiums. There's a particular gravity to being the middle child when the eldest becomes an icon. Joe, bigger, louder, instantly marketable, would roar into popular culture as Road Warrior Animal, one half of a tag team so singular that promoters didn't promote over them, they promoted around them. Marcus, the youngest, would wrestle as the Terminator, learning the ropes in the same regional circuits John would grind through. John had to find a narrow path between those poles, the shadow of a legend above him and the urgency of a younger brother behind him. If the family had a language, it was competition softened by loyalty. If it had a rule, it was this: no one rides for free. Family life in that context wasn't a montage of trophies, it was a workshop. The brothers compared grips and argued over leverage the way other kids argued over chores. They spotted for each other in the living room before they ever elbowed someone under lights. Animal's rise heightened the contrast. Joe's success meant wrestling was real, paychecks, travel, a way to turn grit into a living. But it also imposed a ceiling on shortcuts. With a brother so famous, nepotism would always be the accusation if John moved too fast. So he moved deliberately. He became, by temperament and by necessity, a student of the unseen parts of the job: punctuality, conditioning, match structure, and small decisions that turn a card from a poster into a night that actually lands. That orientation guided his entry. Rather than chasing gimmicks out of the gate, John studied fundamentals under Nelson Royal. an old school hand, prized economy, and ring geography. How to be in the right place so that everyone else can be in the right place. When Johnny Ace debuted in 1986, he didn't arrive as the heir to a myth. He arrived as a worker who could be trusted with the basics. The difference is crucial. Legends are built on moments, careers are built on habits. The first proving ground was Florida Championship Wrestling, then an NWA stronghold where theory turns into muscle memory. Florida didn't care about your last name so much as your ability to do the loop. Drive, lift, wrestle, repeat. The 2 runs with the NWA Florida Tag Team titles meant less stardom achieved than trust earned. Title or not, you're doing the towns, you're making time, you're learning which corner of a small building holds sound, which fans you can work on the way to the finish, which referee breathes too loud when he's counting. A parallel apprenticeship looked minor on paper, but major in practice. Flag bearer for the sheep herders, carrying a flag seems ceremonial. In fact, it's a front row seat to the craft of entrance psychology. How a crowd transitions from talking to watching. How heels radiate menace without wasting motion. Following the sheep herders into Jim Crockett Promotions extended that education onto a larger TV footprint. You learn to hit your mark when the red light flips on. You learn that a misjudged glance can undercut a partner's heat. You learn that the guy off camera matters just as much as the one dead center. The first American TV identity push came with the dynamic dudes in WCW, Johnny Ace and Shane Douglas, neon gear and skateboards managed by Jim Cornette, until the famous turn toward the Midnight Express. It was the exposure without morrow. If you grew up in the house of a road warrior, you already understood. A look isn't a role isn't a job. When Ace lost to Mean Mark Callis on Capital Combat in May 1990, it read less like a burial and more like a boundary line. The act had bumped against a ceiling. The question for Laurinaitis became the same question that had always defined him. Where am I useful? The answer wasn't an Atlanta set. It was a Japanese tour bus. All Japan Pro Wrestling under Giant Baba ran on respect, punctuality, and a match philosophy known as King's Road. Incremental escalation, layered selling, finished structures that reward discipline over flash. As AGPW loosened its ties with the NWA around 1990, Laurinaitis made the decision that would recast him. He stayed in Japan and became a fixture. In America, he had been outfitted for pop. In Japan, he was hired for function. The difference showed up quickly. With Kobashi, Dr. Death Steve Williams, and later Bart Gunn, Johnny Ace evolved into a polished tag team specialist with responsibilities that don't live on posters but do live in office notebooks. Pace the middle of the card so the main event can breathe. Help the right guy glow. Plug the gap when an injury throws a planned pairing off by 10 minutes. The results were concrete. 2 All-Asia Tag Team Championships, 4 World Star Tag Team Championships, and the New Year's Hardcore Heavyweight Battle Royal on January 2nd, 1991. Critics, too, noticed 2 5-star matches, Wrestling Observer's 1996 Match of the Year and PWA 500 ranking number 77 in 1997, all of which measures something more elusive than fame, reliability at scale. He even touched the summit for a night, challenging Misawa for the Triple Crown on February 28, 1998. He didn't take the belts. He did demonstrate why he had been slotted. When the house is full, the office can trust him to do the job and make the other man's job easier. If tag team work was a ledger, the signature was the move, the Ace Crusher. Laurinaitis credits a spark with Barry Windham during training. However, it crystallized. The result was a cutter that felt modern in AJPW. Sudden, modular, a punctuation you could arrive from a dozen angles. The move traveled. Diamond Dallas Page converted it into the Diamond Cutter. Randy Orton scaled it into the viral shorthand of the RKO. You don't just perform a finish like that. You change match grammar. Its adoption across eras was an accident. The cutter fit into audiences' new appetite for out of nowhere, while still rewarding the invisible scaffolding of positioning and timing. It was a perfect emblem for Johnny Ace himself, built on precise preparation. This is where the family comes back into the frame in a deeper way. In North America, the surname Laurinaitis was already branded by Animal. Face paint, spikes, squash match devastation. You can't out Animal, and promoters didn't want a derivative. What Laurinaitis learned was to differentiate by usefulness. The older brother's fame was a double-edged sword. It opened doors, It closed rooms in a sense that any whiff of favoritism drew locker room side-eye. From the start, he understood the antidote. You're only here because of Joe. Whisper was concrete. Repeatable value. Never miss a flight. Never show up out of shape. Never melt down when a finish changes at 6:45 p.m. The effect of Animal on John's early career then was paradoxical. It nudged him towards the business and simultaneously forced him to prove he belonged in it without leaning on the family pedestal. When Booker saw his name on a run sheet, expectations spiked in the opposite directions. Either he'd be an instant star, or he'd be exposed as merely the brother. The way out was to become the worker who amplifies rather than imitates. Ace didn't try and replicate Road Warrior's spectacle. He learned how to frame a partner's fire, how to protect Bruiser's aura without turning a match into a stunt show, how to make a near fall breathe. In doing, he made himself indisposable to a style that demanded credibility over charisma. Nor did Animal's halo vanish once John found his lane overseas. It followed him as a constant comparison. In Japan, the Road Warriors had left deep footprints, monsters, and was a known commodity. Johnny Ace's version was different, less about overwhelming force and more about fit. That contrast helped him. He wasn't expected to bowl over Misawa or Kobashi. He was expected to dance with them at the right tempo so the crescendo meant something. Yet the comparison still mattered in the background. When Japanese press or fans heard Laurinaitis, when they saw Ace was a foreigner who respected the house style, who could be slotted into different pairings without wobbling the tour's spine, Animal's image set the outer edge of the silhouette. Ace filled the interior with craft. There's also the way Animal's career shaped the stakes. When your brother is part of a once-in-a-generation act, the industry's appetite for another Laurinaitis headliner is low. The appetite for a trusted Laurinaitis pro is high. John leaned into that market reality. The belts of the AJPW are proof, but the pattern matches more than the hardware. Credible partners, meaningful slots, and the office choosing him when the schedule gets thin and the card needs glue. You can see it with the Williams-Ace pairing. Two Westerners complementing Japanese main event gravity without eclipsing it. You can see it with the Kobashi-Ace chemistry. One man's righteous blaze, the other's thermostat. Inside the ring, this produced a second education. Long before he ever wore a suit or carried a talent binder, Johnny Ace had to navigate egos, aches, and politics at the human scale. Who needs to shine tonight? Who's nursing a hamstring? Who were in the last finish and can therefore absorb this one clean? In America TV years, the dynamic dudes had tried to tell the crowd who he was. In Japan, the crowd told him who he had to be. Dependable, adaptable, a pro's pro. He listened. As the 1990s closed, Laurinaitis approached a natural transition. He had achieved everything his particular lane offered. Titles, resume wins, respect, and a signature move that outlived territories. In June 2000, he retired from the ring. What came next wasn't a nostalgia tour, but a translation. The quiet skills he'd owned as a ring general upscaled into the office. He returned to WCW during its turbulent final stretch, earning credits for stepping into a head booker role during a period when regimes overlapped and authorship muddied. Regardless of who signed which format, what emerged was the truth. The work was recognized. Laurinaitis could manage product, not just minutes. The one-night U.S. title tournament at Crown Lance Storm stood out to fans precisely because it looked like what Ace always valued: coherence, stakes, follow-through. He went from keeping the machine running to helping dismantle it from the inside. When the walls closed in, he did what rats do: scurry for a way to survive, no matter who he had to step on the way, much like his climb up the corporate ladder. When Laurinaitis retired in 2000, he didn't leave wrestling, he shifted it. From respected gaijin in Japan to a headset in WCW, he moved into booking formats and writing finishes. When WWE absorbed WCW in 2001, most of Atlanta's playbook was discarded. Laurinaitis was one of the few carried over, not for star power, but for order. Vince McMahon had visionaries in spades. What he needed was someone who could turn a Wednesday brainstorm into a Monday live broadcast. Johnny Ace could. His first stop in WWE was a producer, then as director of talent relations. The title sounded clerical. In reality, it was a triage and translation. Wrestlers break down, promoters dream up, TV needs to land at 8:57 p.m. Laurinaitis became the bridge. He knew what a finish cost on a body because he had taken it. He knew what a finish earned on a card because he had laid one out. That dual fluency bottom promotions. By 2004, he was the vice president of talent relations, inheriting a desk once occupied by Jim Ross. The optics mattered. JR was the voice of the Attitude Era, beloved by fans and respected by wrestlers. Johnny Ace was not beloved. He was measured. That was both his shield and his curse. The developmental boom magnified this. WWE had outposts in Louisville, Cincinnati, and later Tampa. The job was to staff tomorrow's Raw while keeping today's SmackDown upright. Laurinaitis' signature was breadth over flash. He signed waves of athletes from football, powerlifting, and bodybuilding backgrounds. Some hit: Brock Lesnar, Batista, John Cena. Some missed and were never seen again. But the philosophy was clear: volume, not romance. If 10 athletes walked through the door and 2 stuck, the system worked. For talent, that calculus felt cold. To Ace, it was math. Reliability scaled. Stardom could be hoped for. Depth had to be managed. That detachment crystallized the phrase future endeavored in company emails, termination letters, and eventually WWE.com. Cuts were softened with the boilerplate line: "We wish so-and-so the best in their future endeavors." Laurinaitis' name became shorthand for those calls. Workers dreaded seeing his number light up their phone. Some described him as robotic, others as polite but distant. Always a corporate cadence, never the friend. The irony is, he wasn't necessarily harsher than past gatekeepers. He was simply the one holding the gate during an era when WWE expanded to global dominance and then contracted to protect margins. Mass releases in 2005, 2006, and 2000 all bore his voice. To fans, Johnny Ace had been a tag wrestler. To talent, John Laurinaitis was the man who ended careers before they began. The wellness policy only sharpened those edges. After Eddie Guerrero's death in 2005 and the Benoit tragedy in 2007, WWE enforced stricter drug testing, mandatory evaluations, and suspensions. Laurinaitis' office administered them. Suddenly, the man who once protected partners in All Japan was telling stars he'd be benched for 30 days. Some praised the consistency, others accused him of selective enforcement. Either way, he became the face of politics in a business that hated politics. WWE eventually folded that perception into storylines. In 2011, Laurinaitis appeared on screen as the executive vice president of talent relations and the interim general manager for Raw. The gimmick was simple: a corporate yes man in a suit, hiding behind buzzwords like people power. It worked because it wasn't far from the truth. His monotone delivery, his awkward hand gestures, his reliance on phrases like the WWE Universe, all read as a parody and a reality all at once. Fans booed, not because he was acting, but because he was recognizable. The man who called to end your favorite wrestler's contract was now cutting promos on CM Punk. The detachment of the office became the heat of the character. His feud with Punk in particular illustrated the blurred lines. Punk, the anti-corporate loudmouth, railing against yes men, squaring off with the embodiment of the corporation. The promos wrote themselves because the dynamic was already real. Laurinaitis didn't have to invent a persona, he just amplified the one that existed backstage. In that sense, people power wasn't just a gimmick. It was an exposure of what wrestling had become, not just a carnival of characters, but a corporation where executives were as visible as wrestlers. So he was a builder or a butcher? The answer depends on who you ask. Randy Orton has credited him with guidance and developmental. Others accused him of stifling creativity by pushing cookie-cutter athletes over unique characters. For every Daniel Bryan who broke through despite the system, there was a dozen names lost. What's clear is that Laurinaitis saw wrestling less as a stage for mavericks and more as a pipeline to be maintained. He wasn't trying to discover the next Hulk Hogan. He was trying to ensure that next week's Raw had 12 segments filled. In corporate terms, he was risk management. In wrestling terms, he was a man who traded originality for predictability. That predictability carried costs. Talents whispered that he sided with management over performers, always delivering Vince's line instead of advocating for wrestlers' concerns like JR did when he was the one in charge. The perception grew that he climbed ladders by keeping his head down and his bosses happy, even if it meant pushing talent down the rungs in the process. The phrase company man fit like a tailored suit. His critics saw him as a rat who survived every regime change. Bischoff out, Ross out, Stephanie in, Triple H ascendant, always finding a way to remain necessary. His defenders countered that survival itself was proof of skill. In a business where few last decades, Laurinaitis kept a paycheck because he knew how to make himself useful. By the time he was phased out of talent relations in 2012, replaced by Triple H's Performance Center vision, Laurinaitis had become a paradox. He helped populate WWE with one of its deepest roles in history. Cena, Orton, Batista, Brock, Bryan, Punk all came through pipelines he oversaw. Yet he became the symbol of every talent who never made TV. Every phone call that ended a dream, every endeavor that led to indie shows and half-empty gyms. He blurred into his own heel character, the suit who never made decisions without heart. On television, fans booed him. Backstage, workers tolerated him. Upstairs, executives kept him. Because in a business that thrives on spectacle, somebody has to handle the paperwork. By 2012, the office had already shifted beneath Laurinaitis' feet. His last major creative role, Vice President of Talent Relations, was taken from him and reassigned under Triple H's expanding influence. Publicly, it was framed as streamlining. Internally, it was a generational handoff. For more than a decade, Laurinaitis had been the gatekeeper, the man who signed contracts and delivered cuts, the one who set the tone for developmental classes and filtered the communications between locker room and boardroom. But as NXT rose and the Performance Center opened its doors in Orlando, a new philosophy was taking hold. Less about cookie-cutter athletes, more about a blend of independent wrestling credibility and corporate polish. Triple H embodied that shift. Laurinaitis represented the old model. He wasn't gone, not yet. Instead, he was tucked into production roles, backstage agenting, and periodic office assignments that kept him on payroll but out of headlines. His on-screen authority character faded in 2012, replaced by fresher faces. The suit survived, but the spotlight didn't. Laurinaitis still traveled, still appeared in company directories, still sat in meetings, but his presence was no longer central. For years, that became the story. Johnny Ace lingering in the background, not steering the ship, but refusing to be thrown overboard. The locker room saw him differently in these years. Veterans remembered him as a cold executive voice behind mass releases. Rookies knew him mostly as a rumor, the man older talent blamed when opportunities dried up. The new wave of wrestlers coming through NXT, the Sami Zayns, Kevin Owens, Finn Balor's, Bayley's, Charlotte's, and Becky Lynch's. Laurinaitis wasn't the man signing their deals or charting their paths. Triple H and his team carried that authority. Laurinaitis became an office ghost, still visible, still relevant, but increasingly disconnected from the creative lifeblood of the company. And yet he endured. That was always his signature, survival. When Bischoff was out, Laurinaitis stayed. When Ross was out, he stayed. When Stephanie shifted roles, when Triple H expanded power, when regimes reshuffled, he found a way to remain. The whispers about him in the locker room, rat, company man, yes man, weren't just insults. They were acknowledgments of the one truth everyone recognized. Laurinaitis knew how to last. But survival isn't permanence. The 2020s brought a reckoning, not just for WWE, but for the corporate culture that had shielded Laurinaitis for decades. In June 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that Vince McMahon had authorized millions of dollars in hush money payments to cover up allegations of sexual misconduct. Laurinaitis' name surfaced immediately, not just as an executive, but as a direct participant in some of the allegations. The reporting alleged that women within the company were paid to remain silent about relationships and misconduct involving McMahon and Laurinaitis. The fallout was immediate. WWE announced that Laurinaitis had been placed on administrative leave. Internally, staff and talent whispered what many had long suspected. The corporate yes man had finally been caught standing too close to the fire he had spent years tending. For the first time, his survival instincts failed him, the very skill that defined his career. Proximity to power, loyalty to Vince, willingness to execute uncomfortable tasks became the reason he was expendable. In the optics of crisis management, WWE needed to show accountability. Vince was insulated by his empire. Laurinaitis was not. He was removed quickly, with no on-air goodbye, no farewell announcement, not even the courtesy of the future endeavor line he had delivered to so many others. One day he was on the corporate roster, next day he was gone. The scandal transformed his reputation overnight. To fans, Laurinaitis had always been the faceless executive, the bland authority figure in a suit, the monotone voice of people power. Now he was a headline. For wrestlers, his firing was met with a mixture of happiness and bitterness. Some celebrated his downfall as a justice for years of cuts and cold calls. Others simply shrugged, noting that the office had always eaten its own when convenient. The halls of wrestling history, Laurinaitis had gone from survivor to casualty. And yet the survival instinct flickered one last time. Reports circulated that Laurinaitis was cooperating with investigators, positioning himself as a witness rather than a target. For decades he had been accused of being a rat, climbing ladders not through charisma but through compliance. Now, at the very end, those accusations turned literal. To stay afloat, he provided information. To minimize damage, he pointed the finger higher. It was the purest distillation of his career. When the walls closed in, he found a crack to squeeze through. But cooperation couldn't restore the seat he'd lost. For a man who thrived on being necessary, irrelevance was the harshest exile. By 2023, he was gone from WWE entirely, remembered in corporate memory only as a liability, and in fan memory as a butt of people power clips. For someone who held careers in his hands, the silence was deafening. The irony is that his legacy remains split down the middle. In Japan, he's still remembered as a foreigner who adopted to the King's Road style, who delivered tag classics alongside Williams and Kobashi, who innovated the Ace Crusher, a move that became the DNA of the Diamond Cutter and the RKO. There, his name sits in history books as a reliable hand and a quiet innovator. In America, he's shaded by bureaucracy. He's a future endeavored executive, the yes man who signed bodies in bulk and cut them just as easily. The bland voice of corporate WWE in its most corporate era. The fall doesn't erase the contributions, but it defines the ending. Laurinaitis wasn't fired for poor booking or bad scouting. He was erased by the very system he served. For decades, he embodied the role of a company man, a man who put survival above individuality. But when the company's survival requires sacrifice, he was the one offered up. That is where the story of Johnny Ace closes, not with a triumphant Hall of Fame induction, not with a celebrated farewell tour, not with a glowing documentary about innovation. It ends with silence, from Animal's brother to Gaijin worker to tag specialist to office executive, from people power to public disgrace. The through line is always survival, until survival ran out. In a business that thrives on legends and martyrs, John Laurinaitis became something else. A reminder that constants crack, company men get cut, and rats eventually find themselves cornered.
They call me Ace, watch me rise. With a wink and a smile I mesmerize. In this town of chance I find my grace. In the game of love they call me Ace. Cards on the table, I shuffle fate.
Louis Spicolli was born on February 10, 1971, and would leave a lasting impact on the world of professional wrestling. Tragically, his journey was cut short when he passed away on February 15, 1998, at the age of 27. Known by several ring names throughout his career, Louis' wrestling journey took him across multiple countries and promotions. In Mexico, he competed under the name Madonna's Boyfriend, a persona that captured attention for its unique twist. In the US, Louis was best known for his time in the World Wrestling Federation, where he wrestled as Rad Radford. He was part of the company's talent roster during the 1990s, captivating audiences with his in-ring style. Later, he found his way into Extreme Championship Wrestling and World Championship Wrestling, where he took on the persona of Louis Spicolli. It was during this time that his reputation as a versatile and skilled wrestler began to truly solidify. Louis is often credited as the innovator in one of professional wrestling's most impactful finishing moves, the Death Valley Driver. In WCW, he wore t-shirts proudly proclaiming his role in its creation, cementing his legacy in the wrestling world. However, the true origins of the Death Valley Driver are debated. Some suggest that it was first developed by Japanese female wrestler Etsuko Mita, adding an air of mystery to its history. Though his life was tragically short, Louis Spicolli's contributions to professional wrestling, particularly his impact on the development of the Death Valley Driver, continued to be remembered by fans and wrestlers alike. And this is his story. Louis Mucciolo Jr., better known to the world as Louis Spicolli, was born on February 10, 1971, in Woodlands Hills, California. Growing up in a working-class Italian-American household, young Louis wasn't handed much, but he found something that lit a fire inside him early on: professional wrestling. Even as a child, Louis was full of energy, charismatic, mischievous, and endlessly passionate. Though he struggled with weight issues and early bouts of insecurity, he quickly learned to use humor and heart to win people over. Wrestling wasn't just entertainment for Louis, it was destiny. By the time he was just 12 years old, Louis was studying wrestling like a science, attending local matches, memorizing moves, and idolizing heroes like Roddy Piper, Eddie Gilbert, and Ric Flair. While other kids played sports, Louis dreamt of suplexes and steel cages. At 16, Louis took the next step. He began formal wrestling training under the respected Big Bill Anderson in Los Angeles. Despite his young age and a stocky build, Louis impressed trainers with his work ethic and deep understanding of ring psychology. Hungry for experience, Louis worked anywhere he could, often pulling double duty under different names on the same card. He was tireless, willing to take any bump, any role, just to learn. In 1988, as he turned 17, Louis made an extraordinary leap, working as an enhancement talent for the World Wrestling Federation. Through Big Bill Anderson's connections, Louis debuted on TV tapings across California, appearing on shows like WWF Superstars and Wrestling Challenge. Sometimes billed under his real name, sometimes as Louis Spicolli, he entered the squared circle against giants like the Ultimate Warrior, Ted DiBiase, and the British Bulldogs. The matches were short, but Louis' selling was masterful. His ability to make opponents' moves look devastating quickly made him a favorite among agents and veterans backstage. Though still green, Louis' reputation was growing. He was known for his bump-taking ability, his positive attitude, and his willingness to pay his dues, traits that would define both his rise in the business and, ultimately, his tragic fall. Louis spent the early 90s on the independent circuit. He wrestled for Herb Abrams' Universal Wrestling Federation as Cutie Pie and ventured into Arizona in 1991, where he captured the Interwest Wrestling Federation Heavyweight Championship under the alias The Zodiac. After more World Wrestling Federation appearances as an enhancement talent, he returned to Mexico as the Killer Blonde and even wrestled for Japan's Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, until he was fired by Onita for throwing a bottle of urine out of a bus window. He had brief stints in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, where he feuded with Chris Candido for the United States Junior Heavyweight Championship and with AAA in Mexico as Madonna's boyfriend, joining the controversial Los Gringos Locos faction alongside Eddie Guerrero, Conan, and Art Barr. He wrestled in AAA's historic 1994 U.S. pay-per-view, When Worlds Collide. This exposure helped him land back in the WWF in 1995, repackaged by a neighbor, and spent several days in intensive care. Though he recovered, the WWF released him under the condition that he not work for WCW for a year, fearing bad press so soon after the steroid trial. Louis' lifelong dream was to make it in the WWF. After he left the Federation, he isolated himself, and his appetite for party favors grew as he struggled with depression. But by mid-1996, he resurfaced in Extreme Championship Wrestling. Clashing with the likes of Tommy Dreamer, he found a new home. He started off as a babyface, but turned heel, Dreamer would later call Louie a talented, driven performer who left it all in the ring. His time in ECW was short-lived. ECW owner Paul Heyman discovered Louie had been negotiating with both the W and WCW behind the scenes. Combined with his ongoing drug issues, he was let go. Paul Heyman would later comment, "Louie had a spark, a real presence. You could tell he was heading for something big." Louie still remained active. He wrestled for Empire Wrestling Federation, largely as a favor to Bill Anderson, who co-owned the promotion at the time. Then in late 1997, he signed with the WCW. There, Louie aligned himself with longtime friend Scott Hall and became part of the NWO, dubbing himself the Real Innovator. He mocked ECW rival Tommy Dreamer. Behind the commentary desk, he impressed fans with his comedic timing and sharp wit, though he did receive backlash after joking about the Oklahoma City bombing on air. Eric Bischoff saw potential, reportedly describing him as the Chris Farley of wrestling. Scott Hall would comment, "Louie was my boy, man, funny, smart. You could see the pain sometimes, but mostly he was just trying to make everyone laugh." He soon began a feud with Larry Zbyszko, stealing and smashing his golf clubs on live TV. A match between the two was scheduled for Super Brawl 8 on February 22, 1998. His last match was on February 9th on WCW Monday Nitro, where he lost to Chris Adams by disqualification. Bret Hart recalled a conversation between Louie and Owen Hart. Owen sat talking with Louie Spicolli, a good kid who was one of the very few jobbers to find their way to working as a preliminary boy appearing in the opening matches for the WWF. Sadly, Louie had developed the worst case of slow suicide since Rick McGraw, much worse than Razor, Shawn, Kid, or Davey. The day before the India tour, Louie suffered a drug-related seizure, but there he was on the plane. I heard Owen warn Louie that the pills would kill him if he didn't smarten up. Louie said he had seen the light, and I wished I could believe it was true. The same day, the WWF fired Louie Spicolli because of his drug problems and hired Brian Pillman. On February 15, 1998, just days after expressing concern about the rapid drug use in WCW, Louie Spicolli was found dead in his home. The coroner ruled it coronary disease, but nearby were 26 empty Soma capsules, a bottle of wine, painkillers, anti-anxiety medication, and a vial of testosterone. Dr. Joel Hackett, whose name was on the prescription bottles, would later face suspension and charges for overprescribing Louie and other troubled wrestlers like Davey Boy Smith and Brian Pillman. Louie's death rocked the wrestling world, but as Bret Hart would later write in his autobiography, Hitman, there was more concern backstage about looming drug testing than the tragedy itself. WCW didn't allow Louie's name to be mentioned on air, except in passing by Larry Zbyszko, who stayed in character. The company embroiled the Monday Night Wars and continued as if nothing happened. Louie Spicolli was 27, the youngest profiled in a 2004 report on premature wrestling deaths. He was in the midst of a major push in WCW, but when the news of his death broke backstage, the show went on. Bret Hart will quote in his book, "Eric Bischoff was pissed, not about Louie dying, but about the inconvenience. Most of the guys in the back were more worried about the new drug test than losing a friend." Wrestling author R.D. Reynolds later wrote, "In the midst of all these incredible numbers, tragedy struck. Louie Spicolli, who had just turned 27 and was starting to get a push in WCW as a Chris Farley like NWO lackey, died of a drug overdose. Spicolli, who took as many as 30 pain Soma pills daily, had washed down 27 with alcohol. He was found dead in his home at 8:59 a.m., face down in his own vomit. It wasn't his first drug overdose. In fact, in 1996, while working for the WWF, he collapsed after taking 55 Somas and was in critical condition for 2 days. Disturbingly, he had told friends just days before his death that he was concerned that the drug use in the company was getting out of control. The following Monday Nitro opened with a tribute for him. His close friends on the show weren't allowed to mention him at all. The only person who did bring him up was Larry Zbyszko, who had been feuding with. To show just how brazen some wrestlers in WCW were, Dr. Joel Hackett, who had prescribed the pills to Louie, was flown into San Francisco for that weekend's Super Brawl pay-per-view. Today, Louie is remembered by fans and insiders as a gifted talent with untapped potential, a man who was on the cusp of a major breakout when his demons, compounded by grief over his terminally ill mother, pulled him back under. In David Schwartz's expose on early wrestling deaths, Spicoli was listed as the youngest of the profiled wrestlers and perhaps the least known. But for those who saw him work, who knew the passion he brought between the ropes and the humor he brought behind the scenes, Louie Spicoli won't be forgotten. In life, Louie Spicoli was a journeyman. In death, he became a warning, a lesson. His finishing move, the Spicoli driver, lives on in rings today. His name is whispered backstage, along with a mix of fondness and sadness. Tommy Dreamer would comment, he had heart, he had the tools, but the system wasn't built to save guys like Louie. It was built to use them up. He was the first IWF Interwest Wrestling Federation champion, a rising name in 3 major promotions, a friend, a cautionary tale, Louie Spicoli, too young to fall.
I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm normally not this choked up, but...
Born in Cincinnati, Ohio, Brian William Pillman overcame a childhood filled with unmanageable challenges, 30 surgeries before the age of 3 to save his voice. But that wasn't enough to silence him. A star on the football field, he tackled life with ferocious energy, becoming a defensive powerhouse at Miami University. His dreams of gridiron glory burned bright until his injuries knocked him off course. Yet for Brian Pillman, every setback was just a setup for the next act.
The events that have taken place in my life.
The frozen fields of the Canadian Football League to the unforgiving dungeons of Calgary, Pillman transformed himself into a wrestling sensation. In Stampede Wrestling, he soared as Flying Brian, dazzling audiences with aerial mastery. Teaming with Bruce Hart, he became a champion. But Pillman wasn't content to just climb the ranks. He wanted to rewrite the script.
Just in the past 8 weeks have really changed the future of my life.
Then came the big leagues, World Championship Wrestling. Under the bright lights, became the inaugural light heavyweight champion. In matches that electrified fans, when he teamed up with stunning Steve Austin to form the Hollywood Blondes, the duo's brash charisma won them tag team gold, yet success painted a target on their backs.
From going from a point not knowing if I was going to live or not to standing here.
Delusioned with WCW's creative decisions, Pillman took matters into his own hands. He embraced chaos, debuting the loose cannon persona, a character so unhinged that even insiders couldn't tell what was real. Manipulating WCW into firing him, Pillman sparked a bidding war pitting WCW, ECW, and the WWF against each other. In Extreme Championship Wrestling, Pillman's short but unforgettable stint left audiences questioning his every move. And then the big leagues came calling. Pillman signed with the World Wrestling Federation, bringing his mind games to the grandest stage. But just as he prepared to conquer a new frontier, tragedy struck. A near-fatal car accident shattered his ankle.
Signing a contract with the World Wrestling Federation, it's a dream come true.
Grounded from the high-flying moves that made him famous, Pillman reinvented himself. His mic skills became his weapon, and his charisma became his arsenal. Aligning with Bret Hart and the Hart Foundation, Pillman stepped into some of the most iconic feuds of the 1990s.
And it's an opportunity that very few athletes get.
The controversial segment from 1996 with Stone Cold Steve Austin blurred the lines between fiction and reality, shocking audiences and cementing his status as the ultimate provocateur. Every promo, every match, every confrontation became his masterclass in unpredictability. Brian Pillman wasn't just a wrestler. He was a revolution, an athlete, a performer, a master manipulator who dared to challenge the norms of an industry rooted in control. This is the story of Brian Pillman, the loose cannon.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Last night, yesterday afternoon, Brian Pillman was found dead in a hotel room in Bloomington, Minnesota. He had competed the night before in St. Paul. This tragic occurrence, obviously, has shocked all of us here in the World Wrestling Federation.
Brian William Pillman was born on May 22, 1962 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His early years were marked by challenges and adversities that shaped the tenacity and determination he displayed later in life. Pillman's childhood was a mix of struggles, resilience, and an early display of his fighting spirit. Brian Pillman's father, William Pillman, passed away from a heart attack when Brian was only 3 months old. This tragedy left his mother, Mary Pillman, to raise him and his siblings alone. The absence of his father during his formative years created financial and emotional challenges for the family, but Mary was determined to provide her children with as much stability as possible. Despite their difficulties, Mary emphasized the importance of hard work and perseverance. Brian would later credit his mother's strength as a significant influence on his own relentless attitude toward life and success. Brian faced severe health challenges from a young age. He was diagnosed with a throat polyps, a condition that caused reoccurring issues with his breathing and required him to undergo over 30 surgeries before the age of 3. These surgeries were both life-saving and painful, but they left young Brian with a raspy voice that would become one of his distinctive features later in life. These early medical struggles forged a resilience in Pillman that would become a defining trait throughout his life. Despite his health problems, he maintained a fighting spirit, refusing to let his condition limit him. Pillman's school years were characterized by a mix of academic challenges and athletic success. While he struggled in some areas academically, he excelled in sports, where he found a natural outlet for his energy and determination. His athletics became a cornerstone of his identity and opened doors to opportunities that would later define his career. He attended Norwood High School in Cincinnati, where he became a standout athlete. He particularly excelled in football, earning recognition for his talent and his toughness on the field. His early success in sports provided him with a sense of purpose and direction, helping him channel his competitive nature into something productive. Growing up in Cincinnati, Brian found support and encouragement from his community and mentors who recognized his potential. Coaches and family friends played a crucial role in his development, offering guidance and opportunities that allowed him to thrive despite the challenges he faced at home and with his health. Pillman's early years were a testament to his ability to perseverance in the face of hardship, setting the foundation for the charismatic and fearless persona that fans came to know as the loose cannon. As mentioned, Brian attended Norwood High School in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he quickly distinguished himself as a talented and tough football player. Known for his aggression and determination, he was a standout on the field, earning respect from teammates and coaches alike. His performance as a high school athlete laid the groundwork for his future in football. Brian continued his football career at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, where he played as a defensive tackle for the Miami Redhawks. Despite his relatively small stature for the position, listed at 5'10" and around 230 pounds, his determination, speed, and intelligence on the field made him a formidable player. During his time at Miami, Pillman earned All-American honors, a testament to his skill and impact on the field. His aggressive style and work ethic stood out, and he became known for playing with intensity and passion, often outperforming larger opponents. His performance at the college level earned him recognition from scouts and opened the door to opportunities in professional football. His professional football journey began when he joined the Cincinnati Bengals as an undrafted free agent in the early 1980s. Despite the challenges of making an NFL roster as an undrafted player, he impressed the coaching staff with his tenacity and willingness to play special team roles. His time with the Bengals was relatively short, but he left an impression as a hardworking and fearless player. After his stint in the NFL, he transitioned to the Canadian Football League, where he played for the Calgary Stampeders. His experience in the CFL helped him refine his athletic skills and adapt to new challenges, further showcasing his versatility and determination. Brian Pillman met Stu Hart through his connection to Calgary. He was trained by Stu, the patriarch of the legendary Hart family. In the infamous Hart Dungeon, the wrestling training began in 1986 after the conclusion of his football career. Stu Hart was known for his rigorous and often brutal training methods, emphasizing technical wrestling and submission holds. The dungeon produced many wrestling greats, and Brian's time there helped him develop a strong foundation in grappling and in-ring psychology. His background in football and his natural athleticism made him a quick learner, and his time in the dungeon honed his skills, preparing him for his professional debut later that year. He formed the tag team Bad Company with Bruce Hart, capturing the Stampede International Tag Team Championship twice during their tenure. Their first victory came in April 1987. His final appearance for Stampede Wrestling was on August 13th, where he teamed with Bruce Hart and Jason the Terrible to secure a win against the Great Gama, Maka Singh, and Johnny Smith. Bruce Hart, during an interview with the Hannibal TV, in between burps, would comment, "I had just come off, blowing my knee out. Just tore my ACL, so, I'd been out for about 8 months. And there was this old friend of mine who was on the Calgary Stampeders named Stu Laird, and I used to see him in my brother-in-law's BJ's gym downtown. He told me he had a guy who I think was the starting linebacker on the Stampeders at the time who was wanting to get into wrestling. Back in those days, if you had a football player wanting to get into wrestling, it was usually after they had been cut, were at the end of the line, or was off season. But it was right, I think second or third game into the season, Pillman was like the starting outside linebacker for the Stampeders. And so anyway, I told Stu bring him down. And I had met with him at BJ's gym, and he was all like gung-ho to get into the wrestling, and essentially walked away from being the starting linebacker on the Stampeders to, being a rookie wrestler. He understood the ring psychology pretty good, and he was really, kind of big on, he had a bit of a personality to him, and he was pretty dedicated." He would also state, "Pillman took off pretty quick. He personally was tailor-made for the business. In fact, he was the guy who taught Steve Austin most of his stuff. And if Pillman hadn't been derailed by the car accident, which ultimately I think led to taking the painkillers, and ultimately killed him, but he was sort of cutting edge, guy that people would probably be talking about today in the same vein as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or Steve Austin." Brian transitioning from Stampede to a larger platform was a significant move. And he would explain, "After my time in Stampede, I was eager to expand my horizons. In 1989, I had the opportunity to wrestle in Japan for New Japan Pro Wrestling, which was an invaluable experience. Shortly thereafter, I was approached by World Championship Wrestling. They recognized my aerial style and athleticism, and I felt it was the right platform to showcase my skills to a broader audience." Pillman's WCW debut was nothing short of spectacular. On February 20th, 1989, at the Chi-Town Rumble, demonstrating his high-flying and technical expertise, Brian secured a victory, marking the beginning of his influential tenure in WCW. He would later state, "Stampede was crucial. It honed my resilience and versatility. The diverse competition and the mentorship from the Hart family instilled me in a strong foundation. The grounding was essential as I navigated the larger arenas and broader storylines in WCW. The intensity and passion I cultivated in Calgary began my driving force on the international stage." Brian Pillman's journey from the heart of Calgary's wrestling scene to the international spotlight of WCW exemplifies the dedication and adaptability required to excel in professional wrestling. His early experiences laid the groundwork for a career that would leave an indelible mark in the industry. Following his impactful debut in World Championship Wrestling, Brian Pillman, known for his high flying as Flying Brian, embarked on a journey that would see him evolve into one of professional wrestling's most mysterious figures. His early years in WCW were marked by notable achievements, including capturing the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship twice and forming the dynamic tag team, the Hollywood Blondes, with stunning Steve Austin. Despite their popularity, internal politics led to the team's premature dissolution, leaving Pillman searching for a new direction. After the breakup of the Hollywood Blondes, Brian would state, "Post-Hollywood Blondes, I found myself at a crossroads. The wrestling landscape was evolving, and I realized I needed to reinvent myself to stay relevant. I began experimenting with my character, pushing the boundaries of traditional wrestling personas. This journey culminated in the birth of the Loose Cannon, a character that blurred the lines between reality and performance, keeping everyone, including my peers, on their toes." His transformation into the Loose Cannon became evident in late 1995. He adopted an unpredictable and edgy demeanor, often engaging in unscripted antics that left the audience and fellow wrestlers questioning his sanity. A pivotal moment occurred on January 23, 1996, during the Clash of Champions, when Pillman, in a match against Eddie Guerrero, unexpectedly grabbed commentator Bobby Heenan by the collar. Unaware of Pillman's intentions and concerned for his well-being due to his prior neck injuries, Heenan reacted with a 4-letter word on live television, exemplifying Pillman's commitment to his unpredictable character. His actions during that period were unprecedented. He would later state, "My goal was to make the audience question what was real and what was part of the show. Wrestling had become somewhat predictable, and I wanted to inject a sense of chaos and authenticity. By keeping everyone guessing, I aimed to create a buzz that transcended the ring." Pillman's commitment to his Loose Cannon persona reached a zenith during the strap match against Kevin Sullivan at Super Brawl in February of 1996. In a shocking turn, Pillman abruptly ended the match by declaring, "I respect you, Booker Man," directly referencing Sullivan's role as a booker, a term typically kept behind the curtain. The act of breaking kayfabe was unheard of at this time and left both fans and industry insiders in disbelief. Breaking kayfabe so blatantly was a bold move. Later he would state, "I wanted to shatter the fourth wall and challenge the audience's perceptions. By exposing the inner workings of the industry, I aimed to create a sense of realism that had been missing. It was a calculated risk, but I believed it was necessary to push the envelope." Following the Super Brawl incident, Pillman was released from the WCW, a move that many believe was part of an elaborate storyline. He made a surprise appearance at Extreme Championship Wrestling CyberSlam on February 1996, where he delivered a scathing promo, further solidifying his Loose Cannon reputation. However, in April of 1996, a severe car accident resulted in a shattered ankle, forcing him to change his in-ring style and casting uncertainty over his wrestling future. He would later comment, "The accident was a significant setback, but it didn't deter me. I focused on refining my character, ensuring I remained relevant. My plan was to return stronger, proving that the Loose Cannon couldn't be contained by any obstacle." Brian Pillman's evolution from Flying Brian to the Loose Cannon showcased his dedication to his craft and his willingness to challenge the status quo. His innovative approach left an indelible mark on professional wrestling, influenced future generations to embrace authenticity and unpredictability in their performances. The infamous moment occurred during one of Pillman's earliest appearances in ECW. After cutting a scathing promo targeting both the fans and the ECW locker room, Pillman declared that he was not bound by any promotion or authority. He then escalated the situation by threatening to urinate in the middle of the ring as an act of defiance. In a move designed to shock and provoke, Pillman began unbuckling his pants, pretending to urinate on the ring mat. While he didn't actually follow through, the mere suggestions were enough to send the ECW crowd into a frenzy. Fans, known for their passionate and often vulgar reactions, erupted with a mix of cheers, boos, and chants, fully buying into Pillman's unhinged persona. ECW security and wrestlers stormed into the ring to stop Pillman, further adding to the chaos and blurring the lines between performance and reality. The entire sequence was chaotic, unpredictable, and completely in the line with the Loose Cannon character. Pillman had cultivated. Perhaps the most infamous incident occurred during a 1996 segment on Monday Night Raw involving Steve Austin. Pillman, recovering from an ankle injury, was filmed at home holding a gun, seemingly prepared to shoot Austin as he broke into his house. The home invasion storyline sparked outrage from fans and media, with many feeling it crossed the line of good taste. The segment was heavily criticized for its violent implications and received backlash from parent organizations and media outlets. Pillman cleverly worked behind the scenes to negotiate his release from WCW under the guise of it being part of his loose cannon character. He intended to return to WCW at a higher pay rate, but instead using the opportunity to sign with WWF, securing a lucrative deal. This manipulation of contract negotiations was unprecedented at the time and shocked the wrestling industry. Brian Pillman's contract negotiations with World Championship Wrestling in 1996 became one of the most infamous and groundbreaking stories in wrestling history, showcasing his business savvy and willingness to blur the lines between reality and kayfabe. Pillman had developed his loose cannon persona to make himself the most unpredictable and talked about wrestler in the industry. By constantly acting erratic, both on screen and backstage, he created an aura where no one, not even wrestling executives, could determine if he was playing a character or genuinely losing his grip on reality. This persona became the cornerstone of his contract negotiations with WCW. As part of his strategy, Pillman approached WCW President Eric Bischoff with a bold idea. He would be fired from WCW to add credibility to his loose cannon character. The plan was for him to stage his departure, work for other promotions like ECW, and eventually return to WCW as an even bigger star. To make the angle seem legitimate, Pillman convinced Bischoff to draft an actual termination letter and release him from his WCW contract. The belief was that this move would protect kayfabe and cement the idea that Pillman was genuinely out of control. Unbeknownst to Bischoff, Pillman had no intentions of returning to WCW. Once released, he immediately began negotiating with other promotions, including the WWF. By obtaining his release, Pillman had essentially worked the workers, using the very storyline meant to enhance his WCW character as leverage to increase his value in the wrestling industry. He used his brief stint in ECW to further solidify his reputation as a wildcard, cutting controversial promos and creating buzz around his name. During this time, he also met with WWF's Vince McMahon and negotiated a lucrative deal, becoming one of the first wrestlers to secure a guaranteed contract in the WWF, which was an unusual arrangement at the time. Pillman's manipulation of his WCW contract was unprecedented and revealed vulnerabilities in how wrestling promotions handled contracts and talent. His actions forced promotions to rethink how they structured agreements and dealt with wrestlers who blurred the line between kayfabe and reality. Eric Bischoff later admitted that he had been outmaneuvered by Pillman, describing the situation as a rare instance where a wrestler successfully worked the promotion. Pillman's move also showcased his keen understanding of wrestling's evolving business, particularly during the Monday Night Wars era, when competition between WCW and WWF was fierce. Pillman's manipulation of his WCW contract is often cited as one of the most ingenious and audacious moves in wrestling history. It cemented his legacy as a pioneer in using real-life tactics to elevate his career while exposing cracks in the wrestling industry's traditional practices. While risky, his gamble paid off, setting a new precedent for how wrestlers could take control of their narratives and careers. Brian Pillman's struggles with substance abuse and his untimely death at the age of 35 are among the most tragic aspects of his life and career. These issues not only impacted his health and performance, but also left a lasting impact on the wrestling industry, exposing the toll the profession can take on its stars. Pillman faced a series of injuries throughout his career, including a devastating car accident in 1996 that left his ankle shattered and required extensive reconstructive surgery. The accident forced him to drastically alter his wrestling style, transitioning from a high-flying performer to a more grounded, brawling approach. To cope with the constant pain from his injuries, Pillman reportedly relied on painkillers and other substances, a common issue among wrestlers of his era who faced grueling schedules and physical demands. His addiction to painkillers was compounded by the intense pressures of the wrestling business and the personal stressors in his life, creating a dangerous cycle that he struggled to break. Pillman's physical condition visibly deteriorated during his final years in WWF. His reconstructed ankle severely limited his mobility, and he was no longer able to perform at the level that had once made him a star. Despite his health issues, Pillman continued to wrestle, driven by his passion for the business and the need to provide for his family. On October 5, 1997, Brian Pillman was found dead in his hotel room in Bloomington, Minnesota. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack, attributed to undiagnosed heart disease, a condition that had also claimed the lives of his father and grandfather at young ages. Although the heart condition was the primary cause, many believe Pillman's substance abuse and the physical and mental toll of wrestling had worsened his health issues. His death served as a stark reminder of the risks wrestlers face both inside and outside the ring. One of the most controversial aspects of Pillman's death was the WWF's decision to conduct a live interview with his widow, Melanie Pillman, on Monday Night Raw the day after his passing. The segment, led by Vince McMahon, was widely criticized as exploitive and insensitive, with many feeling that Melanie was placed in an incredibly vulnerable position for the sake of television ratings. The interview remains a controversial moment in wrestling history, sparking debate over the ethical boundaries of wrestling storytelling and the treatment of performers' families. Pillman's death highlighted the darker side of professional wrestling, including the physical toll of injuries, the pressure of maintaining an intense schedule, the lack of adequate support systems for performers dealing with substance abuse and mental issues. His passing contributed to a growing awareness of these problems within the industry. In subsequent years, WWF implemented wellness policies and began offering rehabilitation programs to past and present wrestlers dealing with substance abuse issues. While these measures were far from perfect, they marked a shift in how the industry addressed the well-being of its talent. Brian Pillman's untimely death left an indelible mark on the wrestling world. He was remembered not only for his groundbreaking loose cannon persona, but also as a tragic figure whose potential was cut short by circumstances both within and beyond his control. His struggles in passing serve as a cautionary tale about the harsh realities of professional wrestling, inspiring efforts to create a safer and more supportive environment for performers in the years that followed. That was the story of Brian Pillman.
This is Bret the Hitman Hart, and you're watching another original wrestling documentary.
Andrew Martin, also known by his ring name Test, was a Canadian professional wrestler best known for his memorable run in the WWF during the Attitude Era. Born on March 17, 1975 in Whitby, Ontario, Martin stood out from an early age due to his imposing frame, athleticism, and charisma. Towering at 6'6", he had the classic superhero look, long blonde hair, and a sculpted physique that made him an instant visual standout in the world of pro wrestling. Before wrestling, Andrew briefly attended college for criminology, but was uncertain about his future. His life would take a turn when he met Bret the Hitman Hart during a chance encounter. Hart encouraged him to pursue a wrestling career and even helped start him out in his training and connected him with WWF development trainer Dory Funk Jr. After fewer than 12 months of formal training, an extremely short period by industry standards, he was signed by the World Wrestling Federation in 1998 at the age of 23. Andrew made his television debut as Test, initially appearing as a bodyguard for the band Motley Crue during a special Raw is War segment. From there, he was quickly incorporated into a major storyline involving Triple H, Stephanie, and Vince McMahon, wrestling in front of millions of viewers each week during the company's most successful financial and ratings era, the Attitude Era. His fast-track rise made him one of the company's brightest prospects, and many fans and critics believed he was destined to become a main event level star. One of his most defining features was his devastating big boot, often cited by peers and fans alike as one of the best in the business, combined with a solid moveset for a man his size, including the pump handle slam, diving elbow drop, and powerful clotheslines. Andrew had all the physical tools needed for superstardom. Despite his early success, his career soon met internal obstacles. Andrew was known for speaking his mind and not playing politics backstage, which reportedly led to friction with producers and agents. Rather than being rewarded for his honesty and intensity, his unwillingness to play the game resulted in a halted push, and he was gradually relegated to the mid-card, often using tag teams or undercard feuds that didn't fully showcase his potential. Over the years, he became a European champion, hardcore champion, and had a short but notable run with the tag team championships, teaming with the likes of Booker T, Albert, and Lance Storm. Though he never captured a world title, Andrew remained a reliable performer and had a fan base that appreciated his raw power and no-nonsense presentation. After his initial WWF run ended in 2004, Andrew wrestled for various independent promotions, including appearances in Total Nonstop Action Wrestling in 2007 using his real name. He also worked internationally, including stints in Europe and on the Canadian indie circuit, where he tried to reinvent himself and stay active despite lingering injuries and personal struggles. In 2006, Test made a surprise return to the WWE. However, this comeback was short-lived. Years of accumulated concussions, back injuries, and wear and tear had begun to take a toll on his physical and mental health. While the company was making cutbacks and the owners making millions, he was quietly released from his WWE contract in early 2007 in order to save money. Unfortunately, like many wrestlers of his era, Andrew turned to painkillers and other substances as a form of self-medication for his chronic injuries and mental stress. His career outside the ring was marked by attempts to recover, including a reported stint in WWE's rehab program. But the battle with addiction proved difficult. On March 13, 2009, just 4 days shy of his 34th birthday, Andrew Martin was found dead in his apartment in Tampa, Florida, due to an accidental overdose of oxycodone. His sudden death shocked the wrestling world and reignited debates over wrestler health, concussion protocols, and long-term support for talent after their in-ring careers. Though gone far too soon, Andrew Martin left a legacy of what could have been. A performer with the look, the talent, and heart to become a household name, but who never got the consistent opportunity to fully showcase it on the biggest stage. This is the story of Test.
And another wrestler has tragically died. Andrew Martin, who was known as Test during his multiple stints in the WWE, was found dead in his home this past weekend. Will Davis has more on the unfortunate trend in the world of wrestling.
I won't scream aloud in the night. I'm a blood stain on the staircase. I'm a fear in your eye. I'm dead by the light. I'm a knife in your back. I'm rage. I'm the razor in the night.
Andrew James Robert Patrick Martin was born on March 17, 1975 in Whitby, Ontario, a quiet, working-class suburb east of Toronto. Tall from a young age, with a naturally athletic build, Andrew stood out physically, but those who knew him best recall a soft-spoken, respectful kid who rarely drew attention to himself. He wasn't the loudest in the room, but he had a quiet confidence and maturity that set him apart. His upbringing was stable, rooted in middle-class values, and shaped by a calm, disciplined household. There was no sign yet that he was destined for the bright lights of television or the chaos of a wrestling ring. Andrew attended Anderson Collegiate Vocational Institute in Whitby, where he quickly made a name for himself on the basketball and volleyball courts. His height, eventually topping out at 6 foot 6 inches, gave him a natural edge. But it wasn't just his size that made him excel. He was agile, coordinated, and a strong team player. Sports provided an outlet for his energy and gave him a sense of structure. Still, he wasn't the overly competitive type. He liked to win, but he wasn't driven by ego. Wrestling at this point wasn't part of the picture. He admired stars like Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect, but it never felt like something he would do. After graduating high school, Andrew took a brief run at college. He enrolled in a post-secondary program, hoping to find direction or maybe just give himself more time to figure things out. But the classroom didn't hold his interest. He wasn't rebellious, just disinterested. It didn't feel like a fit. He dropped out and did what many young men in his position would do. He went to work. Through a series of odd jobs, Andrew began carving out a niche for himself in Toronto's nightlife scene. With his size and calm, serious demeanor, he was a natural fit for security work. He began bouncing at clubs and events, working the doors at various venues across the GTA. Though the environment was often chaotic, filled with intoxicated patrons, loud music, and late nights, Andrew didn't get caught up in the scene. He was professional, focused, and quietly building a reputation as someone you could count on. While either working security or grabbing a meal, reports differ. Andrew found himself inside Planet Hollywood, a celebrity-themed restaurant that exploded in popularity during the 90s. It was a place where memorabilia lined the walls and stars frequently stopped by when in town. On this particular night, one of Canada's biggest stars happened to be there, Bret the Hitman Hart. Bret Hart, then a top WWF superstar and a Canadian wrestling icon, immediately noticed the massive young man across the room. He saw not just size, but presence. Something about Andrew struck him, a calm intensity and raw potential. They struck up a conversation. Andrew wasn't a wrestling hopeful. He wasn't training or chasing a dream. He was just working, living, and staying out of trouble. But Bret Hart saw something more. The two talked for a while, and by the end of the conversation, Hart extended a life-changing offer. If Andrew could make it out to Calgary, Hart would personally train him, free of charge. No promises of superstardom. Just an open door to a world that Andrew had never truly considered. It was unexpected, it was improbable, and it was real. That moment inside Planet Hollywood marked the true beginning of Andrew Martin's transformation. He didn't find wrestling, it found him. In that conversation with Bret Hart, the drifting years came into focus. He suddenly had a purpose, direction, and a mentor. Long before the lights, the music, and the name Test, there was just Andrew, a towering quiet kid from Whitby who took a job bouncing to get by. The handshake he shared with Bret Hart that night wasn't just a stroke of luck, it was destiny. It was the first step in a journey that would take him from the streets of Toronto to arenas around the world. Andrew didn't hesitate. After the encounter with Bret Hart, he boarded a Greyhound bus with nothing but a duffel bag, a pair of boots, and $175 to his name. I left Ontario with my last $175 and never looked back, he would later say. His destination was Calgary, a city he had never been to, with no job, no place to stay, and no real understanding of the punishment that awaited him. But what he lacked in experience, he made up for in grit. Andrew quickly found himself training under Bret Hart, Leo Burke, and Dory Funk Jr. He was a raw bouncer with no pedigree, but he was humble and hungry, sleeping on gym floors and surviving on tuna and instant noodles. He trained alongside names like Edge, Christian, and Val Venus, grinding it out in bitter gyms and low-rent community centers. Bret Hart later stated, "I found myself reluctantly wrapping my knees and lacing up my boots so I could wrestle Andrew on my precious days off. That day, Andrew went from dreaming of being a wrestler to actually working with the WWF World Champion in his home." By late 1997, Andrew had begun working shows under the name Martin Kane, mostly for the International Wrestling Alliance out of Manitoba. His trail reads like a map of Canada's coldest towns: Portage la Prairie, The Pas, Swan River, places where the ring barely fit into the bingo hall. On October 26, 1997, he competed in a battle royal featuring Jim Brunzell and others, and later that night, he beat Jamal Hughes in front of a sparse crowd, likely still smelling of cigarettes, smoke, and draft beer. He wasn't making much, $50 here, maybe $75 there, but what he was earning was more valuable: experience, toughness, and visibility. In early 1998, Andrew was signed to a WWF development deal. Unlike Edge and Christian, who were sent to Memphis, Andrew was placed on a traveling loop of dark matches and dojo-style conditioning tours throughout the northeastern United States and Canada. That summer, he started making the rounds with the World Wrestling Alliance. On May 15 and 16th, he teamed with Emery Hale in Massachusetts, defeating teams like George Phillips and Vic Grimes.
By August, he was working against Edge and Salem, then facing Giant Silva twice and losing to the Hardy Boys in Quincy. He wasn't being protected in these matches. He was taking losses, learning pacing, and adapting to the WWF style. He wrestled undercard names like Bart Gunn and El Fuego, often in high schools and National Guard armories. His rate hovered around $250 a show, barely enough to cover gas and food. But Andrew's breakout came fast. On September 28, 1998, he wrestled a dark match at Shotgun Saturday, defeating Scott Newhart. A month later, he was flown down to Philadelphia for Sunday Night Heat, where he beat Devon Storm in another dark match, this time under his real name. He was now officially under the WWF umbrella. On December 6, 1998, Andrew made his televised WWF debut as Test, appearing as a bodyguard for Motley Crue on Sunday Night Heat. Just weeks later, he was inserted to the Corporation, Vince McMahon's top heel faction. The rookie was suddenly rubbing shoulders with The Rock, Ken Shamrock, and the Big Boss Man. He debuted in a major storyline match on December 5th on Raw's War in Spokane, teaming with The Rock against Triple H and X-Pac. A week later, he was wrestling Mankind on back-to-back nights at Madison Square Garden and the Rosemont Horizon, two of the biggest wrestling arenas in the United States. For a guy who'd been working at flea markets and churches 6 months earlier, it was overwhelming. But it was also lucrative. $1,500 to $2,000 per week guaranteed, with bonuses for TV and pay-per-view dates. By mid-1999, Andrew was placed in a romantic storyline with Stephanie McMahon. It was risky, but it worked. Fans rallied behind the angle, especially after SummerSlam, where he defeated Shane McMahon in a hard-hitting, lover or leaver match. The plan was laid out by Vince Russo, who was to eventually turn Andrew heel and have him feud with Vince McMahon himself. But Vince McMahon and Triple H decided the storyline would instead propel Triple H into main event status. On air, Triple H interrupted Andrew and Stephanie's wedding, revealing he had married her in Vegas. Russo later said, "The idea was for Test to turn on Steph, but Vince didn't think he was ready, so they gave the spot to Triple H. That changed everything." Andrew was abruptly cut from the angle. No retribution storyline, no feud, no payoff. Behind the scenes, he developed a reputation for questioning creative, clashing at times with Michael Hayes and Bruce Pritchard, not to the point of being blackballed, but enough to be labeled not easy to work with. In a locker room still ruled by politics, that was the kiss of death. Through 2000, he floated in and out of storylines. He was paired with Prince Albert and later Trish as part of TNA. Though the team had chemistry, the booking was uneven. Andrew suffered an ankle injury early in the year that derailed the potential Intercontinental title push. He returned later that year to win the WWF Tag Team Championship with Albert. But by the end of 2000, his stock had cooled. Despite the height, the look, and the crowd reactions, the window was closing. Creative simply didn't know what to do with him anymore. Andrew had all the tools to be a main event player. Size, charisma, in-ring growth, and connections. Bret Hart saw it. Vince Russo saw it. Fans saw it. But timing, injuries, politics, and shifting storylines pushed him off course. He went from sleeping on gym floors in Manitoba to nearly marrying the boss's daughter live on TV. But in wrestling, almost is a heavy word. Andrew won his first singles title on January 17, 2000. Behind the scenes, he was excited but cautious.
He understood the title didn't guarantee long-term elevation. Around this time, he began experiencing mild post-concussion symptoms, headaches, fogginess, mood swings, that would later be linked to early-stage CTE. But like most wrestlers in that era, he ignored the warning signs and kept pushing forward. The quick loss hurt his credibility. His reign ended at a house show. He felt the rug had been pulled out again. Later that year, he captured the WWF European Championship from William Regal. This reign lasted longer and was seen by insiders as a soft reset for Andrew. Another test, no pun intended, to see how he'd handle responsibility with a mid-card title. He worked solid matches and was praised for his improved cardio and ring pacing, but he was also struggling with chronic back pain, often requiring cortisone injections before televised matches. Several wrestlers later recalled that Andrew would sometimes slump over in the locker room, holding his head or neck between matches or trying to walk it off. Though not a prestige belt, the European title gave him more mic time and helped rebuild his confidence. Internally, the company still wasn't convinced he was main event material. One of Andrew's more underrated runs came in 2002 when he teamed up with Booker T to capture the World Tag Team Championships. The pairing worked. However, by this point, Andrew's reputation backstage was mixed. He'd begun speaking even more candidly about creative frustrations. According to several agents, including Fit Finlay and Arn Anderson, Andrew didn't play the game. He didn't kiss up to writers, and he occasionally declined spots he thought were demeaning or illogical. In a locker room where politics often mattered more than talent. While still respected by peers for his dedication and work ethic, Andrew's internal standing suffered. Writers were hesitant to build around him. Still, his work in the tag division with Booker earned him fan praise and kept him active on TV during a transition period for the company. Former colleagues like Al Snow have later said that Andrew took crazy bumps. He rarely protected his head, and his size meant he often absorbed bigger impacts. By 2002, he was reportedly dealing with memory lapses, insomnia, and occasional irritability.
In late 2002 and early 2003, Andrew entered into a romantic on-screen storyline with Stacy Keibler, portraying a possessive boyfriend who slowly turned heel. The angle was intended to be character development, an attempt to show Andrew had more layers than just size and strength. While it gave him steady screen time, the character direction didn't fully connect. His promos were inconsistent, and behind the scenes, there were whispers that Andrew's mental focus was slipping. Several agents noticed that he was becoming forgetful during pre-match planning and more irritable than usual. Combined with his physical injuries, including a herniated disc in his neck, he was increasingly viewed as unreliable. In early 2004, he underwent spinal fusion surgery, the same type of operation Edge and Benoit later had. It sidelined him for the better part of a year. While he was rehabbing, WWE made its decision. On November 4th, 2004, he was released from his contract with no major announcement. Just a quiet removal from the roster. For fans, it may have seemed like a pause, but for Andrew, it marked the beginning of a slow and painful unraveling. One that would span almost 5 years, across multiple continents, and end in complete silence. Following spinal fusion surgery on his neck, he spent most of 2005 in physical rehab. By late that year, he returned to the ring on the international indie scene, working for promotions in Germany, Ireland, Austria, and England. He wrestled cautiously, often in tag matches to reduce impact, but still drew crowds based on name value. Promoters valued him as a marquee import, despite his limited mobility. In 2006, he took bookings in Japan for Pro Wrestling 01, again competing in stiff matches that taxed his healing body. In one match, a shoulder dislocation occurred after a mistimed suplex. He never publicly acknowledged the injury, but was seen icing it backstage while refusing medical attention. It was indicative of a pattern, working through pain, masking serious issues, and self-medicating afterward. He also performed for International Wrestling Australia, appeared on indie cards in British Columbia, and made sporadic appearances in Mexico and Puerto Rico, all while managing visible discomfort and a growing reliance on painkillers to get through matches. In June of 2006, WWE brought Andrew back
as part of its new ECW on Sci-Fi brand. He returned on TV looking physically impressive. He had slimmed down, leaned out, and added definition. His in-ring role quickly expanded, with feuds against Rob Van Dam, Sabu, and the Sandman, culminating in a program involving Big Show and Bobby Lashley. One of his more prominent matches during this run was a triple threat ECW title match on ECW Sci-Fi in January 2007 against Rob Van Dam and the Big Show. He played the monster heel role effectively, and though he didn't win the title, he stood out for his agility and physicality. Despite his strong presence, insiders reported increasing concerns backstage. Agents like Dean Malenko and Arn Anderson noted his behavior becoming increasingly unpredictable. He was sometimes disengaged during production meetings and reportedly forgot about match layouts, something uncharacteristic for him in the past. Some wrestlers later described him as there, but not really there. In February 2007, Andrew was suspended under WWE's wellness policy for a 30-day violation. Though details were not disclosed, it was widely understood to involve prescription drugs. His final WWE appearance came shortly after the suspension. He was released again in April 2007 on his second and final departure from the company. He would post on his MySpace page, "Free at last. I just asked for my release from WWE and got it. Just wanted to thank you fans for the last year. I love to hear you boo me. I always said I would get out of wrestling when it wasn't fun anymore. And that's what I did. Don't get me wrong, I still love wrestling. I always will, but right now WWE is not for me. But no sour grapes. I had some fun up until a month ago, when the politics kicked in, like them always do. And at first ECW was so much fun. I can only imagine when it was the real ECW when Paul Heyman left, what was left of it. Sorry if I let any of you fans down, but I needed to leave there for me. So all you fans, thanks again." After leaving WWE, Andrew briefly joined TNA Wrestling under the ring name The Punisher Andrew Martin. He debuted on the August 2nd, 2007 episode of TNA Impact, aligning with Sting and Abyss to battle Christian Cage's coalition. His only match was at Hard Justice 2007, where he teamed with Sting to defeat Christian and Tomko in a high-profile street fight. The match was solid, and Andrew looked strong, but his performance raised concerns internally. After TNA, Andrew's public behavior shifted. He posted sporadic blogs on MySpace, messages that struck fans and friends as increasingly strange and detached. In one 2008 post, he wrote, "I can't tell if I'm alive or asleep anymore. Days just blend. I keep waking up at 3 a.m. and thinking it's still 1999. Another post dated late 2008 read, "Sometimes I wonder if people would even know I was gone, like if I disappeared. What changes?" Friends close to him like Val Venus and Lance Storm expressed concern privately, but Andrew had become isolated. His communication was inconsistent. He ignored phone calls and disappeared between short indie gigs. His substance abuse also escalated. On September 14, 2007, he was arrested in Tampa for DUI after officers observed erratic driving. Police found unprescribed oxycodone and soma in his system. A second arrest occurred on April 5, 2008 in Pasco County, again related to DUI and prescription drugs. In August 2008, Andrew entered into rehabilitation in West Palm Beach. After completing the program, he began promoting himself as a fitness coach and personal trainer. He launched a YouTube channel and uploaded transformation videos to showcase his progress. In the footage, he appeared healthy and focused, but off camera, sources say he was still battling insomnia, memory loss. His final interview was given in January 2009 on a now defunct podcast. He spoke briefly about his training business and staying in shape, but dodged questions about a wrestling return. When asked about his legacy, he said, "I don't think I'll be remembered. I wasn't a main event guy, but I had my moments. I guess that's all you can get sometimes." On March 13, 2009, 4 days before his 34th birthday, Andrew was found dead in his Tampa condo. Neighbors had not seen him for days and called police. When officers entered, they found him slumped on the couch, the television was on, and a half-eaten pizza and soda on the table. The Hillsborough County Medical Examiner confirmed the cause of death as an accidental overdose of prescription drugs. Later in 2009, Dr. Bennett Omalu, a forensic concussion expert, examined Andrew's brain. The results showed severe CTE. He described the damage as extensive, likely stemming from years of unprotected chair shots, concussions, and the physical nature of wrestling during the Attitude Era. Bret Hart would state, "Death brought Andrew and I back together when we saw each other at Brian Crush Adams' funeral 2 years ago. It was during that sad, dark time that I started hearing that Andrew was having prescription problems again, and I was fearful he might be next. We renewed our friendship and stayed in touch. Andrew Martin was a good man, and I truly liked him. He was always respectful and kind whenever I saw him. I always felt he had a good heart. When I saw him at Brian's funeral, I was afraid he might be next. I hate being right about things like that." That was the story of Andrew Test Martin. In the summer of 1986, the World Wrestling Federation introduced one of its most unusual and strange tag teams, the Machines. Towering, masked, and seemingly unstoppable. The trio known as the Super Machine, Big Machine, and their massive leader Giant Machine burst onto the scene with an air of mystery. Fans and commentators alike speculated. Who were these masked men? Where did they come from? And why did they seem so familiar? The truth was hiding in plain sight. The Machine gimmick was directly inspired by Japan's legendary masked star, Super Strong Machine, who had built a name for himself in promotions like New Japan Pro Wrestling. Seeing an opportunity to bring that intrigue to the American audience, the idea was pitched, most likely by Vince McMahon or someone in creative, to repurpose Andre the Giant, who had recently been storyline suspended from WWF television, into a new masked persona. In the mid-1980s, professional wrestling was booming. The WWF was expanding across the United States. Hulkamania was at its peak, and Vince McMahon was creating larger-than-life characters to draw fans into arenas and in front of their television sets. But in 1986, something unusual happened. A trio of masked men suddenly appeared on the scene, towering, powerful, and strangely familiar. They called themselves the Machines. Super Machine, Big Machine, and the massive Giant Machine. Fans immediately started speculating. Who were these masked men? Their voices, their mannerisms, there was no mistaking it. Giant Machine looked exactly like Andre the Giant, a man who was supposedly suspended from WWF competition. Was this some kind of trick? Was the WWF trying to fool the audience? Or were they just in on the joke? The answers lay in both necessity and inspiration, and the Machines became one of the most bizarre, short-lived, yet strangely memorable acts in WWF history. The Machine gimmick didn't come out of nowhere. It was heavily inspired by the success of the Super Machine, a masked wrestler in Japan, played by Junji Hirata. The character gained popularity in New Japan Pro Wrestling, and Vince McMahon, always looking for fresh ideas, saw an opportunity to adapt it for the WWF audience. Whether McMahon personally came up with the Machines, or it was pitched by someone in creative is unclear, but the concept was built around one key element. Andre the Giant needed a way to stay on TV. By 1986, Andre was dealing with increasing health issues. His enormous size, once his greatest asset, was now limiting his mobility and making it harder for him to wrestle on a regular basis. At the same time, the WWF had written him off television with a kayfabe suspension, keeping him away from the ring. But Andre was one of the company's biggest draws, and they needed a way to bring him back without violating the storyline. And so, the Machines were created. Andre was given a new identity as Giant Machine, wearing a mask that barely concealed his well-known features. To make the faction work, the WWF added 2 veteran wrestlers who had experience under hoods. Bill Eadie, who had previously worked as a masked superstar and later became Acts of Demolition, was the Super Machine. And Blackjack Mulligan, a hard-nosed cowboy from the NWA, as Big Machine. The trio was put under the guidance of legendary manager Captain Lou Albano, and just like that, the Machines were unleashed on the WWF. When the Machines debuted in the WWF, they were immediately placed into a feud with Bobby the Brain Heenan and his family, particularly Big John Studd and King Kong Bundy. This was no accident. Studd and Bundy had been Andre's biggest rivals, and their interactions with the Giant Machine fueled the storyline. Heenan, always the loudmouth manager, insisted the Giant Machine was actually Andre, but WWF officials, referees, and even babyface commentators just played dumb. It was a classic wrestling comedy routine. The heel knew the truth, but the good guys pretended not to. The gimmick reached another level when guest machines started showing up. On occasion, top WWF stars would don the mask and join the faction for the one night. Hulk Hogan appeared as the Hulk Machine, helping them fight off Heenan's goons. Roddy Piper even became the Piper Machine for a night. Every time the Machine seemed outnumbered, a new masked ally would arrive. Fans weren't fooled, but that was the fun of it. However, there was one issue: house shows. At televised events and major matches, the full trio of the Machines were present, but at smaller live events, only two of them would show up, particularly when Andre wasn't available. When this happened, the Machines lost much of their mystique, and the reactions were mixed. Fans expected to see the towering Giant Machine in action, but if he wasn't there, it just felt like two random masked wrestlers in a mid-card match. The inconsistency hurt the gimmick, and after a few months, it became clear this act wasn't built for longevity. The Machines were never truly meant to be a long-term act. The writing was on the wall, the faction quietly disappeared, and the wrestlers involved quickly transitioned into new roles. By early 1987, Andre turned heel for the first time in his career, aligning himself with Bobby Heenan and setting the stage for the historic WrestleMania 3 showdown with Hulk Hogan. The Machine's gimmick was never referenced again once he made the shift. Edie would later return to the WWF in Demolition, one of the most successful tag teams in the late 80s. As Axe, he found more success than he ever did as a Super Machine. Mulligan didn't stick around in the WWF for much longer and returned to the NWA, where he continued to wrestle under his usual cowboy persona. At the time, the Wrestling Observer newsletter criticized the Machine's gimmick, calling it a weak comedy act that wasn't sustainable. It was an unnecessary disguise for Andre and a short-term solution rather than a game-changing storyline. While it gave fans some fun moments, it was never treated as a major threat in the tag division. However, looking back, the Machines did have an impact on wrestling. Proof that a gimmick could be recycled. The Machines were an early example of taking a successful gimmick from another company and attempting to adapt it into an American audience. Though this version didn't last, the idea of repackaging wrestlers under masks remained popular. The revolving door concept of guest members helped inspire later groups like the NWO, the Bullet Club, and even the Shield, where new members could be inserted as needed. While not a groundbreaking act, the Machine showed that lighthearted gimmicks could work, if done correctly. The joke was that everyone knew it was Andre, and that's what made it funny. Today, the Machines are mostly a forgotten piece of 1980s WWF history. They never won championships, they never headlined a pay-per-view, and their time was brief. But for a few months in 1986, the WWF had a masked mystery playing in front of its fans, and even if the audience wasn't fooled, they still played along for the ride. Though the Machines are gone, their story remains an interesting footnote in the wrestling world. A reminder that sometimes, even the most bizarre gimmicks can leave a lasting impression. The fans understood what they were really watching. This was Andre in limbo, treading water until the real story, the one with Hulk Hogan, Bobby Heenan, and WrestleMania 3, was ready to be told. In wrestling, the great stories have a payoff. A WrestleMania moment, a championship run, a heel turn that etches itself into the history. But the Machines, they never made it past the assembly line. No gold, no glory, no legacy. The Machines never held a championship, never headlined a pay-per-view, never had a defining moment to call their own. No LGN figure. In an era where even the most forgettable characters were immortalized in thick plastic, the machines were passed over. There is no stiff-armed, rubberized likeness to be thrown into a battle royal on a child's bedroom floor. No Hall of Fame mention. When legends are enshrined, when careers are celebrated, no one speaks of the machines. They exist only in blurry VHS tapes and the fading memories of fans who once sat in smoky arenas watching a gimmick that no one truly believed in. In a sport where masks have long carried mystique and tradition, from Mil Mascaras to Rey Mysterio, the machines were a failed assembly, an unfinished prototype that never left the warehouse floor. No championship gold, no defining moment, no legacy. Just 3 men trapped in an act no one was buying. And yet, somewhere in the back alley in wrestling history, they still linger, rusted, forgotten, and covered in the dust of what could have been. The World Wrestling Federation of 1993 to 1995 is often remembered through the glossy filter of nostalgia, a colorful era painted with neon logos, cartoonish vignettes, and the rise of standouts such as Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, Diesel, and the 1-2-3 Kid. Yet those corporate polished characters conceals a far more fragile, chaotic reality. Beneath the surface, WWF was a company in deep crisis, grappling with collapsing business, legal pressure, dwelling star power, and a roster so thin that the organization began hiring performers who would never have cleared even the lowest bar in any other era. Wrestlers who survived that period often reduce a talent acquisition philosophy to one grim punchline: all you needed was a pulse. The joke endures because it reflects just how desperate the company had become. To understand why, one must begin with the immense structural failures that defined the early 90s. By late 1992, the WWF was staggering under multiple blows. The steroid trail consumed the company's financial and psychological reserves, drawing public scrutiny at a time when professional wrestling still worked desperately to protect its image. WCW, newly energized by Ted Turner's money and ambition, began poaching mid-carders and main eventers alike, using guaranteed contracts that the WWF could not match. The Hulkamania era was over, and without its charismatic tentpoles, the company struggled to define itself. Live event attendance plunged, television ratings softened, and morale inside the locker room was shaky at best. What had once been an unstoppable touring machine began to sputter. Bret Hart later explained the atmosphere with stark, revealing honesty. While reflecting on his role during the new generation transition, Hart said, "I was kind of proud to be the torchbearer for the new generation. There were so many liabilities on the company at that time, and I was the safest guy. Bret Hart's not going to get busted with an underage girl in a hotel, or we found a pile of cocaine in his bag." His words were not exaggeration. When Hart said liabilities, he was referring to real human risks. Performers whose personal behavior, substance abuse, or volatile temperaments could have imploded on the company during a period when the scandal might have been fatal. WWF needed steady professionals, but it didn't have nearly enough of them to meet its obligations. Behind the scenes, creative teams openly acknowledged that the roster was stretched far past its limits. Bruce Pritchard, on his Something to Wrestle With podcast, has admitted that there were stretches when the WWF simply didn't have enough guys to fill the boards. Jim Ross has echoed that sentiment in various interviews, explaining that during taping heavy weeks, the company would sometimes put inexperienced or barely trained individuals on television because canceling or rewriting the show was not an option. WWF had more hours of content than talent to populate it. The result was an unprecedented lowering of hiring standards, where availability outweighed ability and aesthetics outweighed professionalism. Outwardly, the company attempted to mask a crisis through the New Generation rebrand. Promotional packages emphasized youth, speed, and athleticism, and a bright visual identity meant to distinguish the new WWF from the increasingly outdated heroics of the 1980s. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, Owen Hart, The Undertaker, and The Kid were positioned as the embodiment of a modern wrestling product. Yet this marketing was a thin shell placed over a roster barely held together. While WWF trumpeted a new era of athleticism, it simultaneously filled television time with performers chosen not for talent, but because they filled space. This contradiction gave rise to one of the strangest waves of characters in wrestling history. Critics and fans often focus the absurdity of the gimmicks such as Mantar, The Goon, Fantasio, Sparky Plug, T.L. Hopper, and Duke the Dumpster Droese. Although these characters have become punchlines, they were not born from creative exuberance. They existed because there were not enough qualified workers to sustain weekly programming. When a promotion is starving for talent, it creates workers out of whoever walks in the door, sometimes literally. Costume and concept replaced wrestling pedigree, and characters were developed faster than performers could train. The gimmicks became increasingly surreal because the pool of reliable talent had evaporated. Yet while bad gimmicks are comical in retrospect, the people inhabiting them, the others who slipped into the company during this era, were sometimes far more alarming. The most notorious example is Tony Halm, who wrestled in WWF as Ludwig Borga. Physically imposing, with a tailor-made look for the foreign monster stereotype, Borga seemed like an ideal fit for the new generation mid-card. But his personal history, well documented by Finnish media and wrestling historians, revealed a deeply troubling figure. Borga had variable links to far-right political circles in Finland, publicly displaying a neo-Nazi tattoo, engaged in multiple incidents of violence, and struggled with substance abuse. Years later, he would fire a handgun inside his own home and become involved in a string of controversies. This was not hyperbole or gossip. It was the documented description of a man WWF placed on television during a period when it could not afford additional scandal. Ludwig exemplified the liabilities Bret Hart referred to, men whose presence in the locker room reflected the collapsing of the vetting standards of the era. Borga was not the only example of a dangerous hiring. Throughout the early 1990s, WWF cycled through enhancement wrestlers and short-term signings who arrived with criminal histories, addictions, volatile tempers, or woefully inadequate training. Many appeared on television once and disappeared just as quickly, not because creative plans changed, but because veteran wrestlers refused to share the ring with them again. Shoot interviews from the era described unnerving encounters with performers who didn't understand basic ring structure, who ignored instructions, who worked stiff out of insecurity or inexperience, or were physically incapable of protecting their opponents or themselves. Enhancement wrestlers have always been crucial to televised wrestling, but in 1993 to 1995, the gap widened dramatically between seasoned enhancement workers and men who had no business performing on a national stage. Wrestlers such as Al Snow and Bob Holly have discussed in length how terrifying it could be to wrestle someone who had never taken a proper bump or didn't know how to pose for a suplex. Al Snow, in various interviews, has explained that WWF occasionally used individuals who were barely trained and that working with them was inherently dangerous, and that experienced talent often had to assume the role of the protector to prevent serious injury. Referees from the period have echoed these concerns, admitting that sometimes they feared that enhancement wrestlers were more likely to cause harm than the established heels delivering the offense. WWF's desperation created an environment where local gym regulars, inexperienced trainees, and individuals with as few as 10 matches to their name were suddenly wrestling on Monday Night Raw. In the 1980s, that would have been unthinkable. In 1994, it was normal. Meanwhile, the behavior behind the curtain sometimes reflected the instability seen on screen. While top stars like Hart, Michaels, Ramon, Waltman, and The Undertaker provided professionalism and consistency, the mid-card and undercard were populated with talent whose personal issues put the company at risk. Veterans from that era have described co-workers who arrived intoxicated, initiated backstage fights, engaged in harassment, ignored legal expectations, lied about injuries or illness, or exhibited shockingly unsafe conduct during matches. In a healthier period, many of these individuals would have been removed immediately, But WWF's depleted roster meant that dangerous, unreliable, or ethically problematic figures were kept far longer than they should have been, because there was no one else to fill the schedule. Fans at that time noticed something was off. Only a handful of credible feuds unfolding. The product felt stretched and disjointed. Years later, retrospective discussions often describe late 1994 as a period with a ridiculously thin roster. The creative absurdity of the new generation gimmicks was not a deliberate stylistic choice. It was the result of a promotion propping itself up with whatever human resources it could acquire. By late 1996, however, the tide had begun to turn. The rise of Steve Austin, the evolution of Shawn Michaels, the deepening of Bret Hart's persona, and the arrivals of Mankind, The Rock, Triple H, and Kane created a stronger, healthier roster. Improving the business allowed WWF to reset its hiring standards, quietly releasing many of the unprepared or unstable individuals who had slipped through during the crisis. The company emerged from survival mode into reinvention. Only a Pulse Required was more than a cynical locker room joke. It was an accurate description of a 2-year stretch in which business pressures, legal challenges, talent departures, and creative uncertainty combined to produce a vacuum so severe that WWF abandoned its normal thresholds for who could step into the ring. This era introduced performers who were untrained, dangerous, unreliable, or unethically questionable because the company lacked the luxury of choice. Yet it's also an era that underscored the resilience of performers like Bret Hart, whose professionalism helped stabilize a sinking ship. Today, nostalgia often paints a new generation with bright colors, but beneath that imagery lies the truth. For a brief but unforgettable moment in wrestling history, the world's largest promotion had reduced its hiring criteria to the simplest possible requirement: a strong back, a weak mind, bring your boots, and most importantly, bring a heartbeat. Curt Hennig, famously known as Mr. Perfect, was one of the most talented wrestlers in the history of professional wrestling. Born on March 28, 1958, in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, Hennig was immersed in the wrestling world from a young age, being the son of Larry the Axe Hennig, a prominent wrestler himself. Growing up in a family deeply rooted in wrestling, Curt showed an early interest in athletics, excelling in various sports during his high school years at Robbinsdale High School. After graduating, he pursued a career in wrestling, training under the tutelage of his father and other wrestling legends. He made his debut in 1980 and quickly gained recognition for his incredible in-ring abilities, charisma, and unique persona. His moniker, Mr. Perfect, symbolized not only his wrestling prowess, he was portrayed with excellence, showcasing skills that seemed flawless to the audience. However, the irony of being called perfect lies in the struggles and imperfection that Curt faced throughout his life. Despite his success in the wrestling industry, which included stints in the WWF and WCW, he battled personal demons, particularly substance abuse. His struggles with addiction became public knowledge, highlighting the stark contrast between his on-screen persona and real-life challenges. The metaphorical weight of being labeled perfect only intensified as he struggled with these issues, showcasing the inherent imperfections of human life. His wrestling career was marked by memorable feuds and alliances, including partnerships with notable wrestlers like Rick Rude and the West Texas Rednecks. His ability to connect with the audience through his charismatic performance solidified his status as a wrestling icon. Despite the challenges he faced, he remained beloved by fans and respected by his peers. As his life embodied the metaphorical significance of being called perfect, he showcased extraordinary talent and charisma in the wrestling ring, and his legacy continues to resonate in the wrestling community. This is the story of Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig.
You know he's flawless, without a doubt. In a square circle, he'll knock you out. Oh, he's Mr. Perfect. Hear the crowd shout. Oh, he's Mr. Perfect.
Minnesota, where the north wind blows, where the harmony of love forever grows. join the band in this northern show in Minnesota, where our hearts...
Curtis Michael Hennig was born on March 28, 1958 in Minnesota. He grew up deeply entrenched in the world of professional wrestling, as his father, Larry the Axe Hennig, was a prominent wrestler. This connection to wrestling played a crucial role in shaping Curt's aspirations and interests. Larry Hennig's influence was profound. He not only served as a father figure, but a mentor who instilled the values of hard work, discipline, and dedication. From a young age, Curt was exposed to the wrestling lifestyle, attending events with his father and on a first-name basis with many wrestling legends. This early exposure to the business nurtured his passion for the sport and set the stage for his future career. Curt's upbringing in Minnesota was characterized by active involvement in sports. He attended high school at Robbinsdale High School, where he excelled in athletics, particularly in wrestling and football. His athletic abilities were evident early on, and he quickly gained recognition for his achievements. He was known for being competitive and his natural talent, attributes that would serve him well in both high school and later in professional wrestling. In high school, he was a standout wrestler, earning a state championship and showcasing his technical skills on the mat. His dedication to training and competition helped him develop a strong work ethic that would carry over into his wrestling career. His commitment to excellence and desire to succeed were traits that became synonyms with the Mr. Perfect persona he would later adopt. After completing high school, he briefly attended the University of Minnesota, where he continued to compete in amateur wrestling. However, his passion for professional wrestling ultimately led him to make a pivotal decision to pursue a career in the wrestling industry rather than continuing his college education. This choice reflected his desire to follow his father's footsteps and pursue a path that had long fascinated him. While at the University of Minnesota, Curt's competitive nature shined through. He garnered respect from his peers and coaches. His time in college provided him with further insights into the world of athletics and allowed him to refine his skills. Nevertheless, his heart was set on professional wrestling. During his training, he had the privilege of learning from some of the best in the industry. Notably, he trained alongside fellow wrestlers like Jesse the Body Ventura, Don Morocco, Vern Gagne, and his father Larry Hennig, allowing him to refine his skills while building a lasting relationship with other wrestlers. These training sessions not only provided technical instruction, but also emphasized the importance of wrestling psychology, storytelling, and character development, preparing him for the many challenges of professional wrestling.
Oh, he's Mr. Perfect. Hear the crowd shout. Oh, he's Mr. Perfect. It's what he's about.
In 1979, him and his wife would give birth to their first son, Joe. His wife explained that he just made it to the hospital before she went into labor. His son would comment later on in life that he never missed an event or a game.
And every move, every word is true. Passing a legacy others pursue.
Known at the time as Cool Curt Hennig, his first match listed on cagematch.net against Billy Howard on February 2nd, 1981, at an AWA event in Omaha, Nebraska. He would spend the early part of 1981 bouncing around the AWA doing mostly house shows, but to the suggestion of his father, he went to New York to attempt to make his way into the WWF. He would make his debut in the summer of 1981 and spend the rest of the year working for the McMahons in New York. After spending months losing every match, Curt became frustrated about his position on the card. He decided to head west in search for greener pastures and ended up in Don Owens' Portland Wrestling, where again he would be alongside his father and capture the promotion's tag team title, but by 1984 he would be back in the AWA. In 1986, Curt Hennig, according to The Observer, was appointed as Scott Hall's caretaker. On February 3rd of 1986, him and Scott Hall would win the tag team title, but would later lose it to Buddy Rose and Doug Summers in May of that year. Behind the scenes, rumors were spreading that both men were heading to the WWF. Although on May 25th, Curt would be awarded the AWA title and hold it until December 7th, but lose it to Greg Gagne under mysterious circumstances.
With the perfect flex, he called the
The rivalry between Curt Hennig and Nick Bockwinkel reached a significant climax in 1986 during a legendary 60-minute time limit match for the AWA World Heavyweight Championship. This was the famous 60-minute draw that ESPN aired on New Year's Eve. Doing a 60-minute draw on New Year's Eve sounds like a recipe for suicide ratings, but once they started the match, people were hooked until the end. Curt really showed here just how good he was going to get. Leading up to the match, he had already established himself as a formidable competitor, gaining momentum through a series of victories and building anticipation among fans. The match itself was a masterclass in wrestling, featuring intense psychology and dramatic near falls that kept the audience on the edge of their seats. By 1987, it was rumored in the Wrestling Observer Curt was the one holding the AWA together and their biggest star. But by that time, the AWA was struggling to compete with larger promotions like the WWF and Jim Crockett Promotions. Curt, however, emerged as one of the promotion's top stars and main attractions, especially after he won the AWA World Heavyweight Championship from Nick Bockwinkel in May of 1987. His reign brought some much-needed energy and credibility to the AWA. Bockwinkel was instrumental in passing him the torch, realizing that he could be the next star to lead the AWA. As a champion, he took the role of a heel, which allowed him to showcase his charisma and in-ring skills, helping him to keep the AWA's product relevant. His championship defense against top wrestlers like Greg Gagne and Jerry Lawler helped him become the face of the AWA during this period, but behind the scenes, he's beginning to fall apart. Checks were routinely late, and payouts were a fraction of what he could be making somewhere else. He was becoming a bigger star, but had to think about his family, which now included 4 kids. On August 1st of 1988, the Observer would report that Curt was in negotiations with the WWF.
You know he's flawless, without a doubt. In the squared circle, he'll knock you out.
Curt held the AWA World Heavyweight Championship until May 1998, when he lost it to Jerry Lawler. He finally decided to sign with the World Wrestling Federation. His departure from the AWA was a significant event for both Curt and the AWA itself. His exit came in a critical time, as many top talents had left the AWA, causing the promotion to lose a key star and champion. His decision to leave was influenced by WWF's offer, which promised greater exposure, higher payouts, merchandising, and more career opportunities. After leaving the AWA and signing with the WWF, he realized what a major turning point it had made in his career. The WWF quickly repackaged him as Mr. Perfect, a character known for his cocky, flawless persona, athletic, and perfection in all endeavors. This persona would become one of the most iconic in wrestling history and establish Curt as a major WWF star. His vignettes leading up to his debut showcased him excelling in various sports from football and basketball to golf and bowling, emphasizing the perfect theme. These vignettes were designed to showcase his athleticism and charisma, creating immediate interest in his character. Curt debuted on WWF television as Mr. Perfect in the fall of 1988. His initial matches helped establish his undefeated streak, creating a strong foundation for his character and setting him up as a serious contender in the World Wrestling Federation. He quickly became known for his exceptional in-ring skills, charisma, and ability to cut a compelling promo. He was often involved in high-profile storylines and feuds, particularly with top stars like Bret Hart and Randy Savage. Curt Hennig's Mr. Perfect vignettes are some of the most iconic in wrestling history. Created by the WWF in the late 1980s to introduce his Mr. Perfect persona, these segments featured Curt performing various athletic feats flawlessly, from bowling a perfect game to hitting a hole-in-one in golf. Each vignette emphasized his character's supposed perfection in any activity he attempted, portraying him as an unbeatable and supremely confident athlete who could outshine anyone. These vignettes were effective in building his persona as someone who is genuinely perfect, setting him up as both a villain and a technical powerhouse in the ring. Like a magician, people would always wonder how he got the hole-in-ones and the basketball in the hoop with his back turned, but there was no trick photography and post-production editing. The fact of the matter is Curt possessed a skill set to make most of those on his first or second try. Upon his debut as Mr. Perfect, WWF built him up with an undefeated streak that extended well into 1989. This streak was an essential part of building his heel persona and establishing him as a credible, unbeatable athlete in the eyes of fans. WWF protected his character, allowing him to gain momentum and respect as a performer. The streak set the stage for future rivalries and positioned him as one of the WWF's main stars in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The undefeated angle added legitimacy to Curt's character as he showcased both his technical skill and in-ring intelligence in every match.
Oh, Mr. Perfect with a gleam in his eye, dragging laughs around as he passes by.
Known for his sharp wit and love for pranks, he had a knack for stirring up chaos in the locker room. Among his legendary stunts was greasing the soles of fellow wrestlers' boots before matches, causing them to slip in the ring to the amusement of everyone but the victim. Another infamous prank involved gluing Razor Ramon's boots to the locker room floor, leaving him scrambling before a match. He even once replaced the contents of Owen Hart's protein shake with a less savory concoction, leading to a hilarious post-workout realization. He even orchestrated a fake call to Bret Hart, pretending to be a promoter offering a bogus endorsement deal. His pranks, while often harmless, occasionally crossed the line.
Oh, he's Mr. Perfect. Hear the crowd shout.
He played a sneaky role in the infamous feud between the Dynamite Kid and Jacques Rougeau. Jacques Rougeau would state, Mr. Fuji and the British Bulldogs were the king of ribbers, and they created a lot of animosity. There was already heat between the Bulldogs and us. We were in Madison Square Garden, and we had a 20-minute Broadway with them, and they were the champions. They were upset because they didn't beat us. Then after that, I became a victim of them when they started playing ribs on me. We were in Syracuse, and I wanted to get a flight home to Montreal to see my kids. We were on 6th, the Bulldogs were on 3rd. So I went to Strongbow and asked him to switch our matches. Mr. Perfect was trying to cause trouble. He came to see me in the dressing room and said, Jacques, if I were you, I'd be careful with my stuff. You're on the ish list of the Bulldogs. I said, okay, do you mind checking my bags when I'm in the ring? When I got to the dressing room after my match, Mr. Perfect looked at me right in my eye, then he looked at my bag, then he looked me in the eye, looked at my bag, looked me in the eye, looked at my bag, and then he looked down. So I thought the Bulldogs came in and played with my stuff. I looked through my bag really fast, but none of my clothes were cut up. But I felt something was wrong. So just before I left, I told Perfect, I'm not going to stand for this. I'm going to talk to Vince when I get back. Now I was being accused of being a stooge. Curt would add fuel to the fire when he would tell the Dynamite Kid that Jacques ratted him out to the office, leading to the infamous retaliation where Rougeau struck back with a roll of quarters. Curt's mischief set off a chain reaction, escalating tensions and cementing the incident as one of wrestling's most notorious backstage dramas. Since Curt arrived in the WWF, it was his dream to have Bobby the Brain Heenan as his manager. So when he was paired up with jobber turned heel Lanny Poffo, neither men were excited over the pairing. Although in later years, the genius would admit the 4 months he spent alongside Mr. Perfect were the best 4 months of his 20-year career to that point, it wouldn't come without some growing pains along the way. Before going on live, Regis wanted Curt to join him in a bowling demonstration, but Curt wasn't interested in showing off his bowling skills on live TV. Curt declined, explaining that Mr. Perfect didn't need to prove himself on live television. His refusal was both in character and a clever way to maintain the mystique of his flawless image. The move left Regis and Kathy Lee amused, as Curt's confidence and charisma sold the moment just as effectively as if he bowled a perfect strike.
Are you watching, Mr. Perfect?
I'm watching. Go
All
ahead.
right, babe, here you go.
Good, Regis.
No! but I got close. I got 4 down, didn't I?
Lanny Poffo provided insight into the tense bowling incident. According to Poffo, Curt refused to bowl because he was concerned about maintaining his Mr. Perfect persona, especially ahead of a significant match against Hulk Hogan later on that night. Regis, frustrated by his refusal, expressed his irritation during the show. Hennig instead offered to perform a magic trick, but it led to further awkwardness when Regis misremembered the card during the act. Poffo, feeling caught in the middle, explained that Curt was upset afterward, believing Poffo might have upstaged him during the exchange. Despite the tension, Poffo emphasized that Hennig was a consummate professional and deeply respected among his peers, recalling this as a rare, uncomfortable moment in an otherwise excellent partnership.
Mr. Perfect rides in, the wind at his back, Texas tornado dust on the track. Boots at the floor of that old saloon, filling the air with a cowboy tune.
He captured the WWF Intercontinental Championship by defeating the Texas Tornado Kerry Von Erich. This win marked a significant achievement in his WWF career and established him as a top-tier champion within the promotion. On August 6th of 1990, Curt, Haku, and Brady Boone were involved in a bar brawl in St. Louis, which led to the arrest of Haku and Brady Boone. Curt was reportedly involved too, and apparently took a stool to the head. The brawl occurred after a customer tried to talk to a woman who was with one of the wrestlers, prompting Haku to allegedly grab the man by the throat and toss him across the room. Haku then started choking the man, and it took 4 bouncers and 6 police officers to pull him off. One of the police officers had a chunk of his back bitten out in the melee. Haku was charged with battery, resisting arrest, and destruction of property, while Brady Boone was arrested for battery. When Curt replaced Bobby Heenan as Flair's executive consultant, the Brain was a huge influence on him, and Curt even wore a suit with Mr. Perfect embroidered on the back, just like Bobby Heenan. Vince McMahon called it his Bobby Heenan starter kit. Bobby Heenan would say, "Curt Hennig is a tremendous athlete. His father, Larry, wrestled as the Axe. I called Irene, his wife, the Battle Axe. I've known Curt since he was a kid. Curt was like a Barry Windham or a Ray Stevens. He has the ability to bounce back into the ring. If he does something wrong, he can easily recover." When McMahon was hyping IcoPro as a bodybuilding supplement in the WWF, Curt gave his kid some before a football game. The kid ended up not playing because he had the shits for 4 days and couldn't practice. In the early 1990s, he had issues with absences while he was dealing with injuries, which led to some complications regarding his insurance with Lloyd's of London. He was involved in a significant injury claim that resulted in the insurance company tightening up their policies, as they suspected some wrestlers were not genuinely incapacitated. This was partly due to Curt's situation, where he remained involved in wrestling-related activities, such as being a commentator or executive assistant, even when he wasn't competing in matches. When an adjuster from Lloyd's of London called the H&R department of the World Wrestling Federation to gather more information about a policy, a lack of communication caused Curt's policy to possibly being looked at a little closer and eventually cancelled. The conversation hit an awkward silence when the representative from the WWF spilled the beans about a planned run-in during the next pay-per-view, which was No Way Out. Throughout the following week, Curt no-showed several WWF live events. At one time, he did speak with Vince McMahon over the phone, and it was reported he would be signing a lucrative contract with the company as a wrestler. When Curt no-showed WWF's pay-per-view No Way Out, the office realized it was something more than just a cold. In the April 7, 1997 edition of The Observer, Dave Meltzer would write, "Vince McMahon and Bruce Pritchard had a meeting with Curt Hennig and his father Larry last week at WWF headquarters in Stamford. Reportedly, Vince and Pritchard were an hour late and the Hennigs were just about to walk out and leave when they arrived. During the meeting, they discussed the possibility of Curt returning, but it reportedly didn't go well, as Hennig was still upset about the WWF costing him his Lloyd's of London insurance policy, which would have paid Hennig a $300,000 lump sum payment. If you recall, WWF wanted Hennig to return to the ring a few months ago, and in the midst of negotiations, WWF sent a letter to Lloyd's of London over the insurance issues. That resulted in Lloyd's cancelling Hennig's policy. Bruce Pritchard reportedly sent the letter that caused the problem, and in the meeting he claimed to know nothing about it. In turn, Hennig pulled out a copy of the letter, signed by Pritchard, and showed it to him. Anyway, the meeting didn't go well, and WCW is confident that he'll be coming to their side when his WWF contract expires. Last week, they had Larry Hennig on the show to cut a promo, specifically to show WWF that CURT isn't with them. As for CURT, word is he's much bigger and bulkier than he has been in recent years. Draw your own conclusions from that. He would also write, there must have been major heat between CURT and Vince for not only CURT to jump, but to burn Vince and the company on 2 consecutive weekends on his way out the door. The story going around is that CURT had no interest in returning to the ring, as he was a very short time away from a lifetime disability settlement from his Lloyd's of London policy, which would have paid him a reported $300,000 lump sum. However, something happened that Hennig blamed Vince for, which led to Lloyd's not paying him the lump sum, which without the lump sum probably would have to lessen CURT's reasons for not wanting to return to the ring. Lloyd's no longer sells insurance policies to pro wrestlers after having to pay out such a high percentage of those that purchase policies in the short time that they were offered. Rick Rude, Ted DiBiase, Road Warrior Animal, Curt Hennig, and Nikita Koloff, among others, all collected on these policies. In the case of all but Animal and Curt, collected a big lump sum for permanent disability and to never return to the ring. When he decided he was going to return due to bitterness with McMahon, he decided to contact Bischoff and WCW. If it actually happened this way, then Bischoff and WCW would be much less in jeopardy of a tampering charge if Curt came to them rather than the other way around. In 1997, Curt was involved in a road rage incident in Iowa that led to his arrest. According to reports at the time, he became involved in a dispute with another driver while on the road, and the situation quickly escalated. The incident reportedly ended with Curt physically confronting the other driver, which led to a charge of assault. Curt eventually debuted in the WCW. He was brought in as a major name from WWF and quickly aligned himself with big factions within the WCW. Initially, he joined the Four Horsemen, but soon betrayed the group to align with Hollywood's NWO. This betrayal was a significant storyline, especially as it took place during the War Games match during the Fall Brawl event in 1997, where he turned on the Horsemen and helped the NWO win. In 1998, he continued to play a prominent role within the NWO. He later became part of NWO Wolfpack, the splinter faction led by Kevin Nash, but eventually shifted back to NWO Hollywood, joining Hogan again in the main faction's battle against the Wolfpack. This period involved a lot of shifting alliances due to the ongoing storyline between NWO Wolfpack and NWO Hollywood. Throughout 1998, he had notable feuds with WCW stars like Diamond Dallas Page and Goldberg. He challenged Goldberg at WCW's Bash at the Beach in July 1998, though Goldberg's popularity was at its peak, and he defeated Curt in the match. Due to lingering knee issues, his appearances became less frequent by late 1998, and he eventually took some time off for rehabilitation. However, his WCW run was still notable for his storytelling impact for adding his charisma to the NWO storyline.
There's only one thing that I hate, 'cause it's a bunch of crap. I hate rap. I like NASCAR.
After he returned from his injury, he became involved in a faction known as the West Texas Rednecks, alongside fellow wrestlers Barry Windham, Kendall Windham, Bobby Duncombe Jr., and even Virgil, who is now known as Curly Bill. This group embraced a cowboy persona, and their antics provided a humorous yet competitive edge to the wrestling landscape. They would briefly feud with the No Limit Soldiers, a group represented by Master P, who would only make 2 appearances at $1 million apiece. After that, the group of relatively unknown wrestlers would be left to their own devices, and like the original No Limit Records, would fade away. The West Texas Rednecks gained popularity for their catchy theme song, I Hate Rap, which humorously criticized the rise of hip-hop culture and wrestling. The faction's dynamic allowed Curt to showcase his versatility transitioning from the serious Mr. Perfect character to a more lighthearted persona that resonated with fans. Despite being the supposed villains, the Rednecks were ironically more popular with certain WCW audiences due to their anti-rap stance, highlighting the divide in musical taste among fans.
What really burns my ass are the people that live in that Atlanta area, the people that Rick Rude made a lot of money for, the people that knew Rick Rude that didn't show up to his funeral, and stuff like that. You know what? It's built up something it's a frustration that only I can control. I'm telling you right now, wrestling lost one of its greatest athletes and one of his best money makers, and I lost my best friend.
The death of Rick Rude, some say, would be the beginning of Curt's downfall. The two had been best friends since grade 8. According to Curt, when he returned home from the funeral, he had 2 messages on his answering machine from Rude, asking if he had Eric Bischoff's phone number. He ended the message saying, "I'll see you later," words that would echo in Curt's memory for the rest of his life. In a letter, Curt would write, "I knew Rick Rude for more than 25 years. We met in the 8th grade in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. Rick and I were so alike, always scheming. I remember one time I stole a pair of hockey skates from this kid. I told Rick that I got these skates, and if he sells them for me, I would split the money. Rick thought that was one heck of a deal. He took the skates and sold them, back to the kid I stole them from. When he got caught, he never told on me. That's the kind of friend he was. From that moment on, we knew we were best friends. When someone doesn't stooge you off at that early of an age, that's really something." Most close to Curt would agree that he was never the same after Rick Rude's death. But instead of it being a wake-up call, it became a snooze button, delaying the inevitable. The XWF was a promotion that ran from 2001 to 2002, which was founded by Jimmy Hart. Curt would make his debut. This time Bobby the Brain was his agent instead of his manager. In the 2002 Royal Rumble, Curt made his return to the WWF, now calling itself the WWE. Originally he was brought back with Dustin Rhodes, and it was only expected to be a one-off as Curt was signed to the XWF at the time. After the reaction he received from the Rumble, the company decided to bring Mr. Perfect back after not being seen on WWF TV since 1996. But with the creative process changing since the 90s, the writers just didn't know what to do with him. When he returned, Curt lost most of his matches, and displeased fans would see this as the company jobbing him out. Behind the scenes, Curt was trying to get a handle on his addiction. At this time included a cocktail of pain medications and steroids.
But your dad had to be thrilled, though, when he first found out that you were going back into the WWE.
Oh, yeah. My dad, and he's not so thrilled when I got...
suspended? Yeah. Just suspended. That's all we got right now. You're just suspended.
You can't understand how that happened, but...
During the flight back from England's Insurrection pay-per-view, Curt caused quite a scene, spraying people with shaving cream and repeatedly provoking Brock Lesnar into a fight. The two had known each other from their time in Minnesota, before Lesnar joined OVW. As a newcomer, Brock was hesitant to respond, concerned about causing trouble, but was advised that not standing up to Curt could hurt his reputation in the wrestling world. Eventually, he took him down in the aisle more than once until David Finlay intervened, telling him to stop. Curt tried to egg him on further, but Paul Heyman advised Lesnar to ignore him. According to another account, Lesnar first grabbed Hennig and slammed him against a plane door, causing panic among passengers who feared the door might open. Upon returning to the States, Curt would wrestle one more match in the WWF in May of 2002 against Matt Hardy on Sunday Night Heat before he was fired. In December, there was an incident at a bar in Minneapolis involving Brock Lesnar and Curt Hennig. Although details are scarce, it's clear Lesnar wasn't pleased with some comments Hennig made about him. The situation didn't escalate, but Lesnar reportedly fired back verbally, cutting a heated promo on Hennig and storming out of the bar. Later that year, he would begin making appearances in TNA, where he would feud with Jeff Jarrett for the NWA heavyweight title, as well as form a tag team with BG James. His last match was January 8th of 2003, when he defeated David Flair in an axe handle on a pole match. The WWE Hall of Famer and the Baseball Hall of Famer crossed paths at a banquet dinner in Rochester, New York. Later, they teamed for a memorable Mr. Perfect vignette where Curt hit a home run. They shared a love for hunting and fishing, embarking on trips to places like British Columbia and the Florida Keys. Curt was in Tampa, Florida for a wrestling event and had planned to participate in an autograph signing. He had been out with friends and seemed to be in good spirits. However, those close to him noted that he had been dealing with various health issues in the preceding months, including complications from mixing different substances as well as abusing others. On the morning of February 10th, Curt was discovered unresponsive in his hotel room. Despite attempts to revive him, he was pronounced dead at the scene, 6 weeks before his 45th birthday. Curt's journey from a young boy in Minnesota to one of wrestling's most iconic figures exemplifies the power of passion, resilience, and dedication. His legacy endures, inspiring future generations of wrestlers to pursue their dreams while navigating the complexities in life. His story is a testament to the impact of family, friendship, and the unyielding spirit of a true champion. He married his high school sweetheart, and together they had 4 children. His son Joe followed in his father's footsteps, pursued a career in wrestling under the ring name Curtis Axel, for 15 years in the WWE, even becoming Intercontinental Champion and co-holder of the tag team titles twice.
In the sweat circle, he'll knock you out. Oh, he's Mr. Perfect. Hear the crowd shout. Oh, he's Mr. Perfect. It's what he's about.